So, morning. Good morning, Pension Task Force. Not to say the whole name, because I don't think we need Pension Task Force. It is July 22nd. Great. And here we are. And so let's get going. John, who would like to walk us through these? John, is that you or Sarah or?
Let's take a moment to just give folks an opportunity to review
Oh,
last meeting.
okay.
First.
You
So
want
if
that
there
first.
were
Good.
any questions, any
Yep.
things that you needed more information on, or task force discussion about the last meeting.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all back here today. Before we get too far into the agenda, I think it's great that we always have this time to reflect back on previous meetings, just to kind of look at it. And so far, we've had 2 meetings through this process, and we have really important work ahead of us. At the first meeting, it was mentioned that we need to have honest conversations with each other, and that we're here as a group of individuals, not separate factions. And I think those are ideas that we can all get behind or in support of. Since our last meeting, I had a chance to talk with Molly and Eric, Kate, Leona, and Dan, just about how things have been going so far. And as we were starting to reflect together, we noticed we had some similarities in our thoughts so far. And we'd like to take some time this morning to address the entire group with kind of our shared thoughts. And we're going to have a variety of topics we'd like to look at, from agendas to our duties, covering Act 75 as a task force.
Sure. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to add that to the agenda to have that conversation?
I'd love to go through it now, because I think
Sure.
there's parts where if we go
Sure.
through it now, there might be time then to be like, okay, well, yes, we actually need to address this now, but later in the agenda also, and possible retweak of the agenda, especially near the end of the.
Okay, and I will just remind us that because being on YouTube, it's very tempting for us to think that we're talking to those people out there in the world, and we're not. We're talking to 13 of us here, and it is pretty awkward that we sit in this kind of long line here, but there have been some instances, not here on this task force, but where people in meetings seem to be addressing a larger audience out there and not talking to other task force members. So just so we all remember that who it is that is taking part in this conversation and is actually part of the conversation, just a reminder. So yeah.
Awesome. Dan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I guess for me, just looking at things, I guess going forward, it seems like it's important as a committee and a group. To me, it makes sense to maybe formalize the process a little bit more, in the sense of creating an agenda at the end of a meeting together a little bit more. I know you've been asking, what do you want put on the agenda? But to me, it just makes more sense to try to, all of us come to whether it be with a vote or whether it be just some type of agreement amongst all, just some of the things to put on the agenda and do it. Again, just for me, it's like, what is the process of us making a decision? More, does it have to be more formal in those sense of the committee? And if it also seems we're 2 meetings in, but I'm not really sure on where really as a committee, what is our focus? I know the last time they did this, they set up some guiding principles, and these are the principles that we're going to follow. So again, to me, it just seems to make sense that for us to move forward, should we formalize principles of what we as a task force find to be important, because that's going to be really what our goalpost is when we start making decisions and start voting and start trying to decide what we think is the best path forward on this, and how are we going to do that. So I think that's important for us to sit down and take some time, whether it be at the end of today or set it up on an agenda at the next meeting, just take some time to really think about, what are the principles that we all can agree are important for this, and what are the things that we're going to do to push this forward and take the path that we all agree on where it needs to go and what we're going to do. So for me, like I said, just general, maybe more of a formalized process going forward. Not that it is that, but I personally have heard from others, it seems like we're here and it's the perception out there that it might not be as formal as and open as it was said to be. So.
And Kate, did you have a part that you would like to add in also with regards to agenda or reports?
Yeah, we just feel very strongly that we're in a point where we should be creating the agenda together, using time at the end of the meeting to be able to do that, and also how we're going to address all the charges that are in front of us. We just feel like that would be a better way to have shared voice in the process.
And Leona, can you speak to, we've been talking about witnesses coming and joining us, and I know Leona was hoping to speak about that this morning.
So really, in regards to the witnesses, we've had some great, testimony from the Joint Fiscal Office, and that has been very informative and very helpful. And we're just looking forward to more variety of witnesses as we go along in the process, outside of just the JFO office. So that would be awesome.
So can I ask a question about that? Is when we made the list of who we needed to hear from,
Yeah.
that's a kind of a growing list
Yes.
that we would keep adding to. So, and we also have at the end of today, some conversation about the public input process. How
That's awesome.
Yes, thank you for adding that to the agenda. And also, I really thank you for sending out that list of information, bringing together what we've all talked about. I thought it was really helpful to take a look at that and see not only what we've discussed, but kind of start to see a path forward. And so I thought that was great. I was reflecting on our agenda item last time about the report, and we focused on the recommendations. And there's a great section at the beginning about the guiding principles, speaking to what Dan said. And we're going to have more talk of recommendations today. I just want to make sure we make the space to the organization of this task force is very unique in that it's a diverse stakeholder group. And I just want to make sure we make the space to chart our own path. And I think what would really be helpful is, maybe next meeting, we could take a look at our charge and take a look again at that list and kind of put together a work plan of, okay, we should have a meeting dedicated to this topic. And this, these are the experts we'll bring into that meeting. It's going to take a little time to bring the actuary and professional services on board. And, I think we can use that time to really put some context around the numbers that will eventually come back from the professionals, the actuary. So I just want to encourage us to make some time for that, to think about collectively how we want to meet our charge. And the information bring to bear on that. The information list that was sent out in between meetings was a really good start on that. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
So I think to kind of wrap up that part, I mentioned possibly looking at the agenda, recognizing that we already have some people scheduled today and respecting their time. But if there's no objection to setting 20-25 minutes at the end today where we can all work collaboratively on the agenda, I'd like to, I don't know if we need to make a motion to accept that. We spoke about formalizing the process potentially, but getting agenda creation on as a task force today at the end will be great.
I understand the need to be more formal and to make motions and stuff. I'm not sure that I feel the necessity to do that because in my mind, it it makes it less conversational, and I feel strongly that these 13 people should be here talking to each other and not, I guess, this is more the size of one of your committees, so it's harder for me to imagine how you operate that way, but on our committees, we only take a vote when we have to show an action. I mean, if there's, otherwise we just have discussion. I'm
And
fine
I
with
think,
that.
and I guess I would just add to that, that the request for us to be more collaborative with building the agenda is, you know, received and
Yeah.
we agree, we're fine. I mean,
Yeah,
it was a little hard from day one to build that agenda when, you know, when there was clearly a body of background information that we all needed to cover together. And as we have moved through these first couple of weeks, I hope you recognize in the agendas, the requests that we've heard from you about what you want to cover. And we can certainly take the last, you know, that last
Yeah.
time on our agenda today to talk about the agenda for the next meeting. And we can tell you what we've already lined up in response to previous requests, and we'll figure out how we fit that in together.
That would be excellent.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I think what, you know, for me personally, I think I think what we'll find is after, you know, a couple of meetings, we've all kind of got our feet wet. I personally am not, you know, this is not something I do every single day. So just getting used to everyone here and getting more comfortable with being in the room with everyone and doing that. So I think as time goes on, we'll certainly be more upfront and speaking more to what we're thinking and saying and going. So like I said, for me, that just seems to be where we are right now. Just we're getting comfortable and in speaking with everyone outside of this and also with you. I think everyone takes this charge very seriously. And I don't think anyone here, you know, we have spent a lot of time in the last few weeks just getting together as a group, talking about this and understanding it and really understanding it. So if anything, I hope that's the biggest message that we can put out there is that, not that you don't either, but I know for the 6 of us, we take this extremely seriously and we want to just make sure at the end of the day, when we vote, we're all comfortable with what the result is. So.
I couldn't agree more. But I do want to say that I hope you're not thinking of this as us and you.
No, not at all.
Because that shouldn't be the
Yep.
case at all. We are not, I mean, there are 6 union representatives here and 6 others, but it's not this group and this group.
Oh, no,
We're
and
all-
that's not,
Okay.
and if that's the
Okay.
sense, I didn't mean that. That's
Okay.
not the sense at all. It's just us getting together because, you know, we have different, you know, we have different views on things and I, you know, with Andy and Eric and Kate, they all have different views than I have.
Right.
So it's just kind of us understanding each other and knowing where we're all coming from and making sure that, you know, we understand where you're coming from and understanding that we're all heading in the same direction.
And I would hope that those conversations would be part of this group of
Sure.
where we're
Yep.
coming from, not in separate groups,
Yep.
because we all need to be here and engaged. And
Mhm.
so I really want to make sure that we're not thinking of this as sides
No,
at
not at
all
all.
in any way.
And our point of bringing up this topic this morning was to ensure that it's not separate sides, that it's us working collaboratively, that we're
Yeah.
working on the agendas together, that we're making decisions together, that we're deciding on witnesses together. We're talking about panelists, talking about public hearings again, as a group. So that's
Yep.
why we're bringing this forth, because we want to make sure that we are all here together.
Molly?
It occurs to me while I'm sitting here, I'm taking myself back 30 years to wilderness trip leading, but it's like we're doing the norming part of group formation, which is, you know, you form and then you norm. So we're creating the norms, right? And then there's storming, we got to look out for that part. And then you move into performing. Okay, I think this is Knowles, I'm not sure, but I do have one little piece that's perhaps a little bit of storming. So put on your seatbelts, that I wanted to offer from the last meeting, which was that there was one point when we were talking about the hearings, and we were discussing whether or not to have hearings and perhaps the timing of the hearings. And a comment was made about how listening to testimony when people didn't understand the problem. And I just wanted to raise that didn't sit super easily with me, because there was an assumption that the people who were testifying may not have understood the problem. And while I totally agree that most of those of us who were testifying, I was one of them, were very busy doing other things, teaching, et cetera, or in their jobs, and not looking over the budgets and that sort of thing in the same way and with the same level of depth that our public servants in this building were. I think that there was an understanding of the problem, and it made that comment, as I sat with it over the last week or two, has made me wonder if we have a common understanding of the problem yet, or whether we still have multiple perspectives about what the actual problem is. And I think it might do us well to stir up some of the storming, stir up some of the issues that led to the conflicts in the late winter months and early spring months, where teachers and public employees felt the need to come forth and say, no, that can't happen. And find out what's behind that, because, from my perspective, I understand that there's a huge part of the problem that has to do with money, and managing money over the next 18 years. And I simultaneously feel like there's a huge part of the problem that has to do with workforce, and making sure that we're able to attract and retain and maintain our services for all Vermonters. And so I want to make sure that we're defining the problem holistically, and that we're really honoring the stories of those people who can bring us other perspectives, so that they're sitting at this table with us, through us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that was part of, the intent behind giving all the information that came from JFO, and that today is going to come from the treasurer's office. So that, and that our goal was, I think we talked about last time, is that we will come up with I don't know if you want to call it principles or what, but a common understanding. This is the issue that we're dealing with, and that we would all agree on that issue. And I think we talked about, even whenever we have any kind of public input or public hearing, or however that happens, that we would have that sheet available, so that there's an understanding that this is what the issues are, not recommendations at that point, but just a common understanding that all 13 of us have, that these are the issues we're dealing with. And so that we can, I believe that's what we talked about last time in coming up with that. And that was, so we've been trying to lay the groundwork so that we all have a better understanding. And there is a lot of misinformation out there. And in the workforce, in the legislature, I mean, there's misunderstanding of what the issues are everywhere, and misinformation. So we're trying, I think that was our goal in laying the groundwork here, so that we all had a common understanding and agreed upon that common understanding.
Yeah, and that's a perfect goal. And I just also want to acknowledge that, for myself, I'll speak for just myself, I can get triggered when I think about the recommendations from House GovOps last spring. I can get triggered, and I have to do my work and say yep, that's behind me, I'm moving forward, and I think that's possibly there for other people as well. And if we can just own that elephant is potentially in the room, that will help us become a team that's moving forward,
Yeah, I think that's why I think that we need to, everything is on the table.
Yeah.
Everything, but we have a common understanding, but whatever recommendations have been made by anybody in the past are going to be on the table.
Mhm.
and the recommendations from 2009 and recommendations that Dan wants to throw out or Kate or whatever, wherever they come from,
Mhm.
will be on the table. But I don't think that we should lock ourselves into responding to something that has been put out before.
Uh-huh.
If that makes sense, because some of them may be the same, some of them may not be the same. That's for these 13 people.
And we're downstream. Yeah, and we're downstream, we're moving forward.
Right, yes. So whatever happened before is back there. And while it may trigger responses, hopefully we can take a deep breath and say, okay, I got it, we're past that.
That's really refreshing to hear, because, I think that dovetails well with kind of what I was saying about creating this space for our own work and our own recommendations. And I think in terms of, coming to a common understanding of the problem, I think as a task force, we have the responsibility of laying that out in the report that we put out at the end of the day, so that people can digest that. I think that's a great goal.
Anything else about? Yeah.
Just one final piece, and this one might be slightly silly, but yeah, in my class.
Silly is good.
Silly is good. That's how I operate in school. Silly is very important. I spend the first 6 weeks and really throughout the rest of the year in my classroom setting routines and expectations and rule creation together. So my perhaps silly question is, I'm honestly not sure how to refer to everybody at this table. What would everybody like to be called?
Jeanette?
Sarah?
Molly?
Michael.
Eric?
John?
Leon.
Dan is fine.
Corey's. I prefer Andrew as opposed to Andy, but.
Andrew Michael, yeah. Okay. Good, that was good, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, because I've noticed that some people say Senator Parent or Senator White, and I think that we need to think of ourselves as 13 people instead of any titles.
Okay.
Great.
I just finally learned to pronounce the name correctly. I was like,
Well, you can say it under your breath. Okay, good, thank you. Thank you, that was helpful.
Thank you.
So now, let's look at the RFPs here that we have to, for our future work. Let's see, there is a draft of a letter to the treasurer's office, just asking for more information. So do you
Yeah.
want to go through
No, I
that?
can take everybody through. So I worked with Legislative Council, Joint Fiscal Office, and also with Michael for the Treasurer's Office in putting this letter together. So it identifies the scope of work. And I think at our first meeting, we all agreed that we would use a Siegel Group as the actuary for the task force. So this just identifies the scope of work. It doesn't have Siegel starting to initiate any of this work at this point. That will be up to the task force to decide when the work begins. But this at least identifies for the treasurer and for Siegel, the type of work that we want to go. And that's listed in the second paragraph in the numbered order 1 through 5, which is tied to Act 75. I think I'll just go through it quickly because that's the key component of the letter. The first issue is the cross subsidization between VSERS groups. And just so people understand that issue, there was a study done by the former actuary in 2009, which may be inaccurate, but indicated that there was subsidization by Group F to all the other groups that make up VSERS. So that was at least the information at that point in time. And so part of Act 75 requests that we look at that issue again.
Do we have, I don't mean, do we
No,
have
go ahead, Dan.
access to that? Or did we get that or is there?
No,
something-
I have a copy and I can make copies for
Yeah,
everyone.
put it- yeah, put it.
Yeah, it's in talking to, or actually emailing with Michael the other day, there doesn't seem to be any basis for the contribution levels for the various groups that make up research right now. So, I mean, that's something to look at. I mean, and I should also say there's a lot of subsidization in pensions. For example, mortality. Somebody who dies at 65 is going to be subsidizing somebody that dies when they're 95.
Sure.
So subsidization is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's important to understand it and that there's transparency around it. And I think this is one area where at least some people felt that there wasn't a lot of transparency.
Sure, absolutely.
So that's the first issue. The second is various possible changes to VSERS and VSTRS pension benefits, contributions, and retiree health benefits. So without us, we can come up with any recommendations we want, but unless an actuary actually looks at those and analyzes them, we will not know the costs or benefit to them. So obviously, if we come up with different recommendations to change benefits or contribution levels, we would need the actuary to determine how those impact the two pensions. So that's the second one. Various methods of amortizing VSERS and VSTRS pensions and retiree health benefits. So currently, the pensions are amortized, and I think Chris Roop from GFO explained how they're amortized. There are different amortization methods, and so that may be something that we want to take a look at. Right now, the amortization increases by 3% a year until 2038. So that is something, that is just one method of amortization. There are other methods that pensions can be amortized to, and with respect to retiree health benefits, right now that's funded on a pay-go basis, so there is absolutely no amortization, though the Treasurer's Office did prepare 2 documents that we can share with you with respect to how you would amortize that, which is how you would go about pre-funding retiree health benefits.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Can I just add a point of clarity?
Sure.
So I think that you're referring to the unfunded portion of those benefits, not the benefits themselves. And maybe just add that in for clarity, that it's amortizing the unfunded portion of the benefits, the pension and health benefits.
It's the amortization schedule determines what our ADAC payment is. So it's, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, it's amortizing the normal cost plus any unfunded liability.
So there's an element beyond the unfunded piece.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, great.
Yeah, I think what Michael was getting at is the unfunded liability is the part that's captured in the amortization schedule. The normal cost, that's calculated every year.
Yeah.
So just the distinction between the two.
Okay.
It's really just for clarity. If you think it's clear, then.
Okay.
I think Eric.
Eric, go ahead.
A question as well. The funding policy in number 4. What do you envision that capturing?
Well, that would look at everything.
Okay.
But, if we did decide that there was new funding sources or different ways of paying for the pensions, such as, changes to benefits, changes to contributions, changes to the way we pay it, that would be looking at the total way we would fund it. And that is something that if you look at some of NASRA's information, that is one of the things that, they suggest that if you're making significant changes to pensions, that you look at the overall funding methods.
So this would also capture the impacts of one-time dollars or new revenue dedicated to the
Yes.
the pension. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just, should, instead of funding policy, should funding sources, would that be, is that more clear, Eric? I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
Well, it's not just the funding source.
Yep.
It's just an overall funding policy.
Okay.
Of how you go about funding them. And it's not necessarily just looking at, say, new money or one-time money. It's looking at the overall way of figuring it out. And that includes how does an amortization schedule impact funding?
Sure.
Because if we were to propose changing that, that would change the way we would be funding it.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Then the final one is the impact of any pre-funding arrangements for OPEB. So that's just, that was added by the Treasurer's Office, and that's just, again, it's looking at how you amortize retiree health benefits and what the overall impact is to funding those. Make sure we capture that. So that's basically the scope of work. Obviously, this task force would have to come to agreements on any of these. I will have to say that with respect to the cross-subsidization issue, we don't have to necessarily do any work there. That would be something we could just ask the actuary to look at, because that's looking at existing data and not any recommended changes. So that's something that we could start earlier than some of these other things that we require work from the task force. So the rest of it just talks about the timing, and then the amount of money is up to $100,000. And just to make sure people understand why I picked that number, is we have an appropriation of $200,000 for our experts. So I basically took half of that amount and put it there. And so if anybody has any concerns or questions about that, that's why I highlighted it in the letter, just so people understood why that was there.
One question, since 1 through 5 kind of outlines things a little more specifically, would there be good reason to add 6.1 or various other topics that arise? Or will this limit us if we just have these 5 on here?
We could add 6 various other topics that arise. I mean, that's fine.
Everybody feel okay with this the way it is then? And
Any other questions or concerns? So if with that change, is it okay if the co-chairs sign this letter? And
Thank you for doing the work.
oh, no problem. All right, so that was the easy document. So the next document is with respect to retaining a legal expert to look at potential benefit changes and contribution changes. So most of this is following a template that the state requires is followed with respect to the RFP. And so the dates that you see in there are consistent with state contracting. It will take a while for us to hire a legal expert. As you can see, the due date for the RFP is August 20th. But I worked those dates out with legislative counsel just to make sure we were complying with state contracting law. The key part is actually on page 1, 2, 3, 4, under 2.2 scope of work. And so this is basically advising the task force about any constitutional, legal, contractual issues relative to the state pension and retiree benefits. So, so the issues they'll be looking at is if we were to change a benefit or a contribution amount, what are our legal, how can we legally do that? So for example, do we need to collective bargaining over a change? Do we not? And so that law is constantly changing about what you have to collective bargaining over or not, or what you can do unilaterally as a state. And so this legal opinion would be very focused on providing us guidance with respect to changes. So that's basically what that scope of work focuses on. And it's very similar to what we did in 2009 with respect to the legal expert. It's looking at the legal issues around changing benefits and contribution amounts.
And remember that any potential changes that would be being looked at would come from this group. So there aren't any changes that are anticipated to be looked at here. We're just saying that if and when we come up with changes, they're going to look at it.
Right. And so, yeah, this will be looking at what would be needed to do beyond just, we can make recommendations, but, there's a couple of steps that have to occur for those recommendations to actually happen. I mean, the legislature would have to take action through passing a bill, but there also may be a collective bargaining step that has to be done before changes could actually be implemented. Yes.
John, question. And this is really taking a step back from the RFP, like in terms of what's on the page. You mentioned previously there's a a small group of experts that work in this area. Do we have a sense of if we know of anyone who's interested in this work? I would just hate for the RFP to go out and for it to close without any bids and us be back at the square one. So just wondering kind of if we have a sense of whether folks are going to be interested.
Yes, I mean, we are seeking here a national expert in pension benefits. There are actually several law firms that specialize on this. The firm that we used in 2009 was Ice Miller. They still do this work. I checked with them, and I think there's several other firms that do this. I mean, what we're looking for is a legal opinion with respect to changing benefits. We're not looking at litigation. I mean, there's tons of firms that do pension litigation, but that is not what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody to analyze basically, what are the legal parameters that restrict, limit us, or don't with respect to changing contribution or pension benefits, or for that matter, retiree health benefits. Yes.
Would this firm, would they be present in our meetings every time we meet, or would it be work we send?
I think, no, I think what they would do is they would provide us with the legal opinion. I think before we accepted the legal opinion, we could probably invite them via Zoom, because I doubt they will be a Vermont law firm, to participate in a meeting, so that if people have questions about what they wrote, that we can get those questions answered. And if there needs to be a redraft, that can be done. But it's in looking at the legal opinion that Ice Miller did in 2009, there are general parameters about what you can and cannot do that are governed by case law. And so that will just be a guide of how we can move forward. Can the legislature or the state act in doing something without negotiating, or can it do something, or does it have to negotiate? So regardless of what our recommendations may or may not be, we will at least have that guidance about how we move forward after we arrive at recommendations.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead,
I
Molly.
had one question, kind of similar to Andrew's last one with adding number 6. Is it customary that there's only one firm? Or I think of the medical field, I go for a second opinion. Is there ever an opportunity where we would, or a circumstance where we would want to have multiple firms, or have that capacity within this document anyway?
I mean, you could have multiple firms. I'm not sure. I mean, you could have multiple actuaries for that point, but it's a cost issue. And I'm not sure you get a very different legal opinion on these things. I mean, the law is somewhat well settled, though it changes from, as different cases come about, but I'm not sure. I mean, we could, if that's something the task force wants. I mean, it's a cost issue. Though I will say we have much more wiggle room, I think, with respect to the cost of legal expertise than we do with the actuary. The actuary will be expensive. The legal opinion, I think the last time, Michael, I think you told me it was like $5,000 for the legal. 15,000. So last time was $15,000. So we would have some room in the amount that's been appropriated to get a second opinion, if that's what the task force wanted.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily recommending to hire 2. I just mean the capacity for that in the document.
Yeah, I think the only other challenge would be the timing, because as you can see from this, I mean, we're talking about August 20th, the RFP closes. That still leaves it up to the task force to actually select someone from the group of law firms that applies for the process. So I think that would be the biggest impediment to getting a second opinion. But it could be done. We still have a lot of time after that.
Just if it makes Molly feel better, but I think at a law firm, they'd like to have multiple lawyers working on this matter, so we would have multiple, attorneys providing opinion. Areas like John said that are well settled, I think there would be common agreement on those. Areas that are unsettled, be common agreement. And then that gray area, I think they would just describe to us the level of risk, depending on sort of the positions that we take. And so I think probably, whenever we work with legal counsel, they usually set that out well, and I've never felt the need to have a second opinion. So just one.
Any other questions? So is the task force comfortable with moving forward with the RFP? Great.
Great,
Thank you very much.
thanks.
Thank you, John.
Yes, thanks for drafting that.
Oh, no problem.
And you can see that most of all of the pages except that one are the standard RFP
Yes, they
process
are.
with the state. So anybody who ever bids on anything with the state has to go through all of this.
The most difficult thing about putting the RFP together was figuring out the dates. That would work with the task force and work with our contracting laws.
All right, so I think we're moving on to our next topic, which is our treasurer, Beth Pierce. Would you like to join us?
If it's okay, I'm gonna put another chair up here. I don't need a witness, but I have a lot of folders with additional information.
You
and I
can
hate-
do anything you want.
I hate to have
ma'am.
them falling all over the floor, so.
You can,
we'll do it that way.
that would be very fine
Excuse me.
to do. And what we want to do here is go through the first part of the report that came out in January. And we're not getting into the recommendations yet because we're not at that point. Once we get to the point where we're all throwing out recommendations, but we did not want to get caught up into that, the weeds of the recommendations and forget about making sure that we're all on the same page about the issues and where we are. Does that make sense to everybody? That we aren't going into recommendations yet, but although this report does, but we'll stop kind of on page 29 or wherever that is. I'm not sure, but so thank you, Madam
pleasure.
Treasurer. And welcome. Do you know everybody on the?
Yeah, it would be helpful.
Yeah,
As we've talked, I know that there are members of the employee groups, and I'm delighted that they are included this year. The biggest mistake in 2009 was to exclude them because a lot of the work happened after the
Right.
commission or committee finished its work. But I don't know who's with who, although I'm guessing right now that Molly's a teacher based on the way she presented materials, so.
All right, so why don't we go around the room and identify who we are and how we got here, maybe. That would be helpful to you.
Thank you.
Michael Paulson, Deputy Treasurer, appointed by the Treasurer.
Do you remember that?
I think I do.
Okay, great.
Peter Fagan, Representative, House Appropriations, appointed by our speaker.
Molly Stoner, fourth grade teacher appointed by Vermont NEA.
Beth Pichak, appointed by the legislature.
Andrew Emrich, kindergarten teacher, appointed by Vermont NEA.
I'm Eric Davis. I'm an analyst with DEC, and I was appointed by the SEA.
I'm Jeanette White. I was appointed by the pro tem or the Committee on Committees.
I'm Sarah Copeland Hansis, Chair of Government Operations and appointed to the task force by the Speaker of the House.
John Gannon, House Gov Ops, and appointed by the Speaker of the House.
I'm Kate McCann, a high school teacher appointed by Vermont NEA.
I am Leona Watt, and I was appointed by VSEA, and I'm a probation officer at Springfield.
And Dan Trotter, I was appointed by the Troopers Association.
Corey Parent, appointed by the Committee on Committees.
All right,
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Um,
That was-
If it would be okay, I'd like to try to address a couple of things that you folks mentioned in your conversation. I think that just inform on a few pieces that there were some guiding principles, and Senator White, you had a great deal to do with that back in 2009, preparing a guiding principles for this. And I can't tell you how much I endorse the idea of looking at those. They spent a fair amount of conversation on those, and I think that that's a great idea. The equal representation and having folks involved in here, again, that was a mistake in 2009, and I commend the General Assembly for making that happen. I think that's been very helpful. In terms of creating the agenda, again, that's about getting away from that not us, you approach. Everything that's been done over the past and everything that's been done in the legislature that has moved the ball is because people collaborate and work together. So I want to, again, commend you folks for doing that. With respect to the policies and moving forward on this, I do want to respond to anticipation of your letter with some discussions with at least the teachers board. And getting back to Molly in terms of the defining the problem, my 7th grade teacher, Mr. Horner, talked a lot about how to define scientific method, and the first step is define the problem. So I very much appreciate that. I did want to point out, and it's clearly, this is your commission, not me, task force, not me, but back in a little background, Ice Miller was selected, and what they did is kind of do a general parameter and then responded. Individual that was, I know that the VSEA employed her. I think that it might have been along with the Vermont NEA, presented their perspective at the time. That individual was Beth Robinson, so I think people know her fairly well. But I think that you might want to give that a copy of that to your to whoever you select, because I think that having that information, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that the landscape is changing as well. But I think that would be helpful for them in terms of response. If you do not have that, we can provide that for you. Again, I just want to say thank you for all the good work. In my experience and Michael's experiences with contracts is that one page is great, it's important, and that's the crux of what you're trying to do, but everybody gets caught up with the contract terms with the state, whether it's indemnification, liability issues. So plan on having at least a few discussions on that with whoever, especially if you're going to be dealing with attorneys. So no disrespect to attorneys, but I think that that's been our experience in working with folks. What we think is straightforward in those terms of those boilerplate contract provisions, but you can always appeal to the Attorney General's office to give you a little room on those. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I did do a presentation that takes the materials out of the report as well as some other materials. And one of the things I remembered to do this time was put page numbers on it, because and that was an addition about 2 o'clock yesterday morning, but we do have that. So, and I do know that some folks like it electronically. I planned on that. And by the way, I did make copies of other documents, and I made 12 copies, not 13. So Michael, you're going to have to wait to get back to the office. But hey, so the agenda that I was hoping to go through, and again, this is your task force, was to go through the pension funding status, the methods, how we get there, how does this all work, and then go through gains and losses. What are the drivers in the increase in the unfunded liability? A little bit about how an experience study works and what we gained from that and looked at. I just have some attachments that really come from VPIC, of which I'm a member, but and I don't plan on doing a lot on investments, but it's there for your review. And then pre-funding OPEB. That is a hot topic with us. We've been trying to work on that for some time, and then some summary. And I was remiss in pointing out too that it's great to be here and see you all in person, including Chris Roop from JFO, because we've talked many times, but today was the first time we had an opportunity to meet. So I think that's important. If you go to page 3, excuse me, you see the purpose, and I'm going to try to go through some of these quickly. The purpose of evaluation, it really is about assessing the adequacy of the system to pay current and future retirement benefits. It's all about retirement security. You want a system that will be able to pay people this generation, the next generation, the generation after that, and ongoing. It's also about intergenerational equity. If you don't resolve problems, the next generation is going to pay for it. Social Security comes to mind, and the scares that we have, and what will happen if Congress and the president don't act. Outputs, you calculate the accrued liabilities, the actuarially accrued liabilities, you calculate the value of assets. It differs from the market value, and there's a reason for that. And I'll mention that in a little bit. The funding status, what percent is funded? That's an important piece. What is the ADEC? That now, folks that have been here a long time, no disrespect, Representative Fagan, when we used to talk, we'd say, pay the ARC, and it was a really good line. You remember that as well, Senator. I'm sorry, I'm used to that respect level there. But it's now called the Actuarially Determined Employer Contribution. Just so we go through acronyms, GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, created that new term.
Hey, the ADAC doesn't have the same.
It
ring.
doesn't have the ring,
No.
exactly. We got into pay the ARC, and we
Yeah.
were successful with that. And so far, and I want to say thank you, we've been successful with paying the ADEC, even if it doesn't have that same ring to it. Identify some of the losses and gains, and review within the context of the authority, the amortization period, getting to some of your concerns about that. So those are the types of things that evaluation will do. They're taking a look at the long-term sustainability of the fund. They're giving you the measures on where you are, and they take a look at the funding policy, and that's a more narrow approach from an actuary. They're not going to tell you how to do things. They're not going to say you should do this benefit and so on. They're calculated for you, but they're really looking at the adequacy of how much is funded and how you fund that, and how you amortize that over a period of time, which is actually in the purview of the General Assembly. We are in a closed system, and I wanted to get that across to folks. There are two ways to do valuations. The first one is an open, and you really don't do that because it creates all sorts of nuances and problems with it. And an open, although we did that, Representative Copeland Hansis and Representative Gannon, when we were in that risk assessment back in 2019, which really is a precursor to where we are now. They did an open valuation to say what's happening now and what's it going to look like with some of the trends. When you do an valuation, you're looking at a closed valuation. What does it look like as of June 30th? So it's essentially a snapshot at that period of time. And as I said, it's done annually. I've struggled with how to present, how this all works. And so I've done a little bit of reading. I've cobbled together here, so I want to give credit where credit is due. The Siegel Group, some of their valuations and their reports in other states, tutorials, as well as GRS, which stands for Gabriel Roeder Smith, another actuarial firm. And that piece in the middle really comes from them. And I thought that was pretty helpful. And I put an example here, hired at age 30. Somebody comes in, I'm 67, so if I were to start, I'd have a different scenario in terms of probability of retirement than someone who's age 30 or somebody that comes in. We see a lot of teachers that come in mid-career, for instance. So they're going to be different decisions and probability. So what's the probability they're going to reach retirement? Are they going to leave before that? And actuaries estimate that based on characteristics of the census, whether it's age, whether it's turnover that we've seen historically, consolidation. Act 46 had an impact on that. We tried to give them information about what happened in there and folks that were in different schools and provided that. So when will the member retire? At age 30, you have different options. I'm already past the normal retirement date, but I plan to stay here for some time. So just for the record, but and so you're going to retire with an annual benefit. What does that look like? Are you going to retire early retirement? Are you going to do normal? And how much is that benefit going to be? And that's based on, again, these are all based on assumptions, what the salary increases will look like. So they're looking and saying, you make X now. And when you get to retirement, you're likely based on wage scales, something that's called productivity, which is looking at gross domestic product and what's happening in different areas that impact the productivity of the workforce. They're going to take a look at cost of living patterns that the state has, and they're going to put some assumptions about what that benefit would be. And there's obviously inflation to that. I always use the example. I'm an older person. When I got out of college in 1976, I had a job that was $13,000. And people said, wow, how did you get that? It was pretty good. And I don't think I'd be working for $13,000 now. And unfortunately, by the way, some people do. And that is a travesty in terms of income and what happens in terms of people in this state. And then how long are you going to live in retirement? That has changed over time. And what we do find is people are living longer, not as long as some of the mortality tables that the Society of Actuaries came out with. And that was one of my discussions with actuaries at the time. A new table came out in 2014, and then they've had updates every year since. And those updates said, yeah, they're going to live longer, but not quite as much as the first one. So we've tried to grapple with that as we're looking at the impact it has on the actuarial results. You take all that information. They do this for every single person. And they create a range of probabilities because that 30-year-old or myself or that 40-year-old, they're going to be different options that they have. So they create a range of probabilities. So for instance, I would be in there split over a different period of time for different probabilities of what Beth is going to do. Possibly more at certain assumptions. They aggregate that up for every single person in the workforce. And then what they do is they put that in what's called a projected value of future benefits, the normal cost, the actuarially, the liability that those individuals will have. And then they look at assets. And so what assets are available, and those come from investment earnings, they come from employee contributions, they come from employer contributions. And I will say that employees have stepped up to the plate since 2010 and are contributing more and have really worked hard on this. As we're looking at some painful decisions, we need to recognize that they've been there as part of the conversation. And then you produce these results, which I had on the previous page, some of the results. Page 5, and I'll try to move a little faster as we move on, but page 5 is just what that looks like in terms of accrued, actuarially accrued liability. What is it going to cost for those present and future benefits? And then what is the normal cost? And a normal cost means that if I was hired today, you would not have any past service costs for me, that part of the liability. And what it would cost each increment each year divided up. What are you going to need to put aside so when Beth hits that retirement, or when that 30-year-old hits that retirement, or when Eric hits that retirement, what is the amount of money you're going to need to put aside each year to make that happen? And then what those future normal costs will look like. This is all done on a present value basis, taking a look and saying, what are the dollars you need in today's dollars to make that work? And so just wanted to explain that as we move forward. Any questions on any of that? I like the GRS piece because it put it into a human context on how does this all work in terms of decision making, and it's a lot of work. Page 6, just the key points, and I'll try to go a little quicker through the different sections. So I try to put some key summary points at the front. And the funding status is deteriorating. The unfunded liability is growing in both plans. The cost of the ADEC is also growing. In the teacher system, that is funded by the general fund for the most part. There's now a piece that comes from locals. We put that in place. I'm trying to remember about 2014, 2015, where they would, if they're on federal grants, that they would reimburse the state for those dollars that are being reimbursed by the feds and transfer those to us. The general fund pays for most of the state piece. There's the state system visas. It's about 36 to 40% of it, and then the other cost centers. So whether you work in transportation, whether you work in human services and you're funded by federal dollars, for instance. And I did not bring the figure, but if memory serves me correctly, someplace about 23% of the dollars that are required for to pay for pensions is reimbursed through federal government, whether it's in human services or transportation. I'll confirm that number, but it's something in that range. Again, there's historical growth in the liabilities. And in our report, we identified that the increase from 2021 to the 19 val to the 2020, the 19 valuation sets the, or the 20 sets the unfunded liability, and it also gives you the recommendation for the ADEC. It's just timing in terms of when this is done and how that impacts the appropriation process. So an increase of 604 million and an increase of just under 97 million.
I have a question.
Sure.
So Beth, one of the first question I asked when we started this is, have we identified all of the problems that are causing the deterioration in the value of the assets and in the capability of the assets actually?
Yeah.
Take the appropriate
That's a very
So,
good question.
And I know that, you know, we've done an experience rating. We have done what we
Mhm.
normally need to do. And I'm asking a question that may not be answerable 100%, but I'm asking your best estimate. Have we identified all of the problems that are inherent in this fund so that we can then address them as a group?
So we're going to get into a little bit more of that on actual gains and losses, but to answer your question, which is a great question, you're not going to be able to anticipate everything. These are estimates. Actuaries prepare estimates. The rate of inflation, for instance, has been going down, 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 down. And the CPIU Northeast is what we use in calculating benefits. This year, and you see that in my presentation, it's up over 4%. Social Security uses a different CPI index, and they're talking someplace north of 5. That's some of it is related to COVID and pent up demand. I'm not an economist. I frequently say that I think that this is a longer term piece. That's my non-professional opinion of this. And eventually I'll be right. I don't know what year, but it's sort of like the, the stop clock there. But they can't predict that. In economic events, no one could predict the Great Recession or COVID. One of the charts in here that you see on investments is the Asian markets that impacted this Brexit. Certainly, none of us voted for Brexit. I don't, and to this day, I'm not sure how that all, again, I tried to predict before that, and I said it's never going to happen. I'm not very good at those predictions. The last time, I know this is a serious issue, but I'm going to say it anyways. The last time I got an election right was McGovern-Nixon, and I didn't vote that way. But those are events that you can't anticipate. But there are things under our control. The national events, inflation, national policy, those are not things that we can control, but local state issues we can. And and you see this later in the presentation, one of the issues that has eluded us, we've brought this up in just about every report that we've sent over to the General Assembly over the past several years, is workforce issues, particularly in the teacher system. If you take a look at the turnover in employees, if you take a look at the retirement experience, it's about 37%. And again, I'm doing this from memory. There's a number in here. We'll see how close I got of the changes in liabilities, the increase in liabilities. The way I've described this to the past in testimony over the years is, you have property tax pressures, you have different pressures, you have new policies around schools and reorganization. As you press the balloon at that end, it pops out at the other end in terms of retirement and its impacts there. And the trick of this is to take a look at the whole cost. We look at it in silos. We look at the impact it has in terms of property tax and property tax relief or whatever it might be. And then we don't look at it and make the link up to what the impact is on the pension system. And my belief is that there needs to be a holistic look at that. It's something that we've testified to that effect over the years. It's a tough one to get your arms around, but that was a big issue, Representative Fagan. The other is the decisions we made while we stopped the process of not funding the pensions and started pay the ARC. We continued until 2015 to pay for the health benefits in the Teachers Fund out of the pension system. And that added over $100 million to the unfunded liability. So there are things in our control. We should identify those and look. Now, I'm not going to get into the property tax debate. That's not my job. And I'm not a workforce expert, okay? But the reality is that you need to take a look at it and define, getting back to Molly's point again, define the problem. And then look at what are your decision and policy decisions that you may want to address there. I'm gonna talk about this more and you're gonna say, you just said a whole bunch, so how much more are you gonna do? But we'll go there. Oh, no, no, no. It's a great question and it's great context as you're looking at this. Page 7 is the funding status, and it's really made up of a couple of things. And one is the status of the pension liabilities. Do you have assets available to meet those? And that's the bottom line. Again, retirement security is what this is all about. We want individuals, when they get to retirement, to have enough income. And to have a fund that's there and not a fund that's deteriorated to the point that there is no security. I read a report recently about the increase in elderly bankruptcy and poverty. And I think that you folks should talk to AARP about some of that. And that's a travesty, again, and it hits Vermont even more because we have an older population. And I think that we need to take a look and say, what are we looking at in terms of security for those individuals down the road? Are we contributing? Is the employer and the employee contributing the plan at the recommended rate? Are we funding the ADEC? We are now. We didn't in the past. And again, as recently as 2015 in the teachers, there was some underfunding. And is there a plan in place to deal with the unfunded liability, that amortization, that date? And is it doable? One of the things the actuary says, well, you have a plan in place to retire this. And the question is, and Chris and I agreed on this number, is that you're going to need to have about $500 million, $500 million in the late 2030s, 2036, that 7, 8 to pay for this. Is that doable? Now, if you put that in present value, it's not that much of an increase. But on the other hand, the state budget is not increasing at that same level. So is it doable? And is it going to be a tipping point where you say, we can't do this? And we want to avoid that tipping point.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
And I don't know if the answer is right now or not, but number one, how are the percentages, if I contribute, Dan Trotter is going to contribute X percent. How was that, or how is that number determined?
That's a matter of policy, and frankly, the legislature sets the benefits, including with the contribution levels. Now, the boards do provide recommendations. Sometimes they're taken, sometimes they're not. Senator White, we've talked a lot about. We're actually involved in a task force right now, on who belongs in Group C, who doesn't belong in Group C. Ultimately, the General Assembly is going to make those decisions. So the General Assembly is the owner and the creator of the solution. We're going to provide information, but it is the General Assembly that's ultimately going to make the decisions, presumably with the governor, and that we don't get to a point if we have collaboration where there would be potentially a veto. You set the benefits. Excuse me, I'll look at you two. You set the benefits, you set the funding policy, and you appropriate the dollars. We provide background. We act as a conduit for the boards. Boards meet generally monthly, a little bit more than that. So we provide support to the boards, and the Attorney General provides legal support to the boards, the Board of Trustees who are fiduciaries to the fund. Does that answer your question, or did I just?
Yeah, no, I'm just,
Okay.
again, I know one of my questions is coming in, and I apologize. I have, my kids gave me a sticker on my fridge. It says, I can't math. So that's where I'm coming from. So the numbers. So I just want to get like when they say, hey, you should contribute, Dan Trotter should contribute this percentage, Andrew should contribute this
Yep.
percentage. Where does that number come from?
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I had one other question, and I don't know if it's possible to get that, but is it safe to assume that if and I don't know how often the actuaries, we have the actuaries doing their thing, but if they said and I'm just going to use 2019, it was this, and now in 2021, it's going to be this. Is it safe to assume that they made changes to their calculations? And if so, are we able to understand what
Yes.
changes they made so we can understand, okay, why did this number go from here to there?
Again, a good question. And there are two ways that happens. One, again, if you go back to that first page with age 30, there are assumptions. How long is it going to take for, what's the probability of a retirement? What's the benefit? Those are assumptions that are built into the valuation. They aggregate that up for every single employee. Those are in the valuation report are done annually, and there's a chart in there that says, these were the assumptions, and this is how much you varied from those assumptions. And we'll have an exhibit in a little while that shows you that. In addition to that, if the assumption is off, you true it up, and you true it up to an experience study, which we do every 5 years. That's a statutory level. That's what happens as a general practice across the country. But I think we agreed and we recommended, and frankly, the General Assembly has changed that to every 3 years. So I think that that's a good move. But you want to true up your assumptions. Does it make sense? Now, again, things can change from there. Inflation being a great example. And I think inflation is the biggest risk because it impacts so many different pieces of the assumptions, whether it's investments, whether it's COLA, whether it's salary growth. And as that changes, it has an impact. So having more frequent helps, but that's what you do. You true up and hopefully make the appropriate changes. Well, the assumptions change, but to the extent that they are supported by any actions by the General Assembly, that those happen in the same process.
Eric has a follow-up
Sure.
up, and then I have one as well.
Yes, thank you. Beth, I have a question on the plan to retire the unfunded liability and how it relates to the funding status.
Sure.
Especially considering our charge includes looking at the amortization schedule. Now, the legislature has been paying the ADEC for since 2008. But the ADEC is predicated on each subsequent payment increasing by 5% in the beginning, 3% in the end. When that was agreed to, I think people said it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Correct.
It's a turning point until payments graduate to a point when you're actually paying down the unfunded liability. Paying the ADEC and paying down the unfunded liability, not necessarily the same thing. So do we have a sense of what sort of deterioration in the funding status was planned versus unplanned? Because there's certainly other pressures that have brought down the funding status, that we did not foresee when we agreed to the amortization schedule. Just something to keep in mind as we think about the amortization schedule.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I interrupted you, so if there's more to the comment or the question, I
The
apologize.
question of how much deterioration was planned, how much do we expect versus how much was unplanned?
So I look at an amortization schedule as a mortgage payment, the analogy. Now, at the end, you own the house. Hopefully here you own retirement security. But it's a period over time. And depending how you set up the mortgage, if you do it in 15 years, if you do it in 30 years, if it's backloaded, interest only at the front, you get different levels of interest that you pay. And at the beginning of a mortgage, you're not seeing the principal in most cases of the loan essentially going down because you're paying interest. And if you look at the amortization tables that are in the actuarial reports, they will show you the same thing, that over time, you're paying off interest at the same time. There's growth in terms of the liability because you're paying interest first, and you have an opportunity loss on that because in terms of paying down the unfunded liability. Now, as assumptions have changed and as realized gains and losses have changed, that schedule changes. Back in 2012, I think our estimate was that it would get worse, just as you said, but by about 2021, things would start to get better. Things didn't work out that way, okay? And the actuary, as we change assumptions and as we change, as real behavior and real gains and losses interact with it, you're gonna see a change in that. It is backloaded. And that was something we changed, I believe, in 2016 with the General Assembly. Our office pointed out that the interest you're paying is pretty high because it's backloaded. Every year it increased in 5% increments. So you're looking at this, you figure out how much you have to pay with the interest, and it's backloaded. We asked you folks to make it 3%, which was a little closer to inflation. So that seemed a little more reasonable. You acted on that, and that saved both systems $165 million of interest. And that saved the taxpayers $165 million of interest. So looking at that, how much, there's a balancing act, because when you change that, that meant you were paying more upfront, just as I said, when you change a mortgage. But I think it's something that you do want to look at. I would caution that you do not want to just kick the can down the road, because that costs the taxpayers in the form of interest. But there are ways to take a look at it. The actuaries in our risk assessment report, which again, Representative Gannon, you were part of that process, as were you, Sarah. I'm sorry, I just did that. Okay. I can't get Copeland Hanses out at the same time, so I get tongue tied. So, hey, what can I say? But I think that there are ways to take a look at that, but just using that and saying, that's just puts the problem out the road. Government Finance Office Association did a best practice. And what that means is you're kicking it down, you're costing more, and you're not solving the problem. The rating agencies do something what they call above water, below water. And if you keep doing that, you're essentially below water and you're going to stay there.
Quick follow-up on that. I agree completely with that, that we've done a lot of work building up the capacity, and we don't really want to cede that. If there are projections from 2008 when the previous amortization schedule was formulated, if those could be shared with the committee.
Absolutely.
Task force, that'd be wonderful.
You know, if I will try, I try to do some of this because we want to make sure that we don't, blow through our actuarial budget very quickly, but we can pull out the tables. I can put something together that looks at some of the assumptions that push that, and then I will run it by our actuaries because, I'm not an actuary. I can do some of the front work and then let them take a look and say, no, you got to change this, you got to do this. But we will try to get you something to get to that effect. And, I've said that, Eric, and this is a compliment, that you're a bit of a actuary wannabe, and I consider that a compliment. So it's a very good question.
Thank
So-
you. I'll take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. If you take a
So I
look,
think Sarah had.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sorry. Representative, there you go.
Quite all right. You can call me Sarah. I had a follow-on to the question that Dan was asking before, but just wanted to also put out there that while the legislature has determined the benefits and the contribution levels, the other part of the equation, which is the demographic assumptions and the investment returns, are completely out of the control of the legislature, with good reason.
Yes.
But still, a significant impact on the position that we're in right now. But I wanted to come back to the question about what those employee contributions are based on, because it has occurred to me that even if you can assess how much of the current unfunded liability is due to underfunding of the past, and you can hope for better demographics and investment returns in the future, there is still a part of that unfunded liability that seems to be due to a system that has been changed incrementally based on the historic employee contribution levels that might have been based on assumptions that are no longer valid in terms of longevity, in terms of how people move in and out of the workforce. And so I guess I would just ask, do we have the ability to ask ourselves as a task force, how would we build this retirement system if we were starting over from scratch and we wanted to make sure that today's 28-year-old is going to be able to live in retirement with a predictable benefit until they're 95?
So we do have historical information on what the contributions are and what share of that is versus the ADEC, or the ARC in the past, and we can provide that to you. Generally speaking, roughly 62% of what's paid to retirement is through investment income, and depending on the year, I mean, when you don't contribute, like in the teacher system back in 1997, for instance, the employee paid more of the share than the state. So those contributions are roughly half, a little more geared, I believe, to the teacher system. That is in the 2009 report, a piece of that. And that one is a long time ago, and I'm going to have to defer and take a look. And we have changed some of the rates, but we can get that for you. One of the concepts that you're talking about is risk sharing. And I think that feeds into, the decision-making around that. And whether those are ultimately everything is actuarially neutral because of the employee and the employer do not pick up that in contributions, it gets picked up, or investments, you get adjustments to the ADAC every year. So ultimately, it's actuarially neutral in terms of combination, but what share people have and how much they contribute is something that varies from state to state. And some of it is public policy decisions, whether you want to, if you have recruitment issues in one group, for instance, or, but we can get you that information, but it really is a lot of that's public policy as well. How much do you believe as a legislator that this person should be paying versus another group in the system? And in the municipal system, there are separate, it's a menu. You can be in group A, B, C, or D. D is actually law enforcement. And in each group, there's a different level of employer and employee costs. And those are only the municipality or the school system, because over 50% of the municipal system is actually non-teacher, non-certified teachers. They pay a separate amount. If they pay for it, they should get, they get the benefit associated with it. So it's a little bit different. In the state system, we call that a single employer entity. So that's all, when you get down to it, it's all together. We don't report separately on that. It's a single employer, but we can break that out for you. Did that answer the question, or am I going around it? Or
Well, what I'm trying to understand is if we were starting from scratch right
Mhm.
now, would our employer-employee contribution rates be what they are now? Or are those vestiges of a system that was designed 30, 40 years ago that has been incrementally changed over time?
So I wasn't around in 1947 or something when either the teacher or the state plan was developed. But my presumption is there was a decision about what share people were supposed to do. How much would be investments, how much would be employer and employee. And it was probably based on, you're going to take this share of the normal cost, for instance, or whatever it might be. We can certainly take a look at what the percentages were, but ultimately that was a public policy decision. You have to fund the whole thing, but who pays what is up to the General Assembly. Has that changed over time? And does it look like what we did in 1970 or 1985 or whatever it might be? We can provide some of that information. I've done some of that for the teacher system. I dusted off the old actuarial reports back to 1982, did some analyses, and I'd be happy to share that with you. I said someone else is going to have to do it for the other two systems because that took up an awful lot of my time. And we will delegate that to somebody at some point in time. Michael, we can talk about that. But we can provide that information for you.
Some people did jigsaw puzzles to pass the time during the pandemic. I take it you were reviewing actuarial reports.
A little
back
bit.
to the 80s.
A little bit, but I did find new hobbies too.
Yeah.
So, I now have decorative flower vases all over the house, which if you look at me, you say, that's not Beth. But at some point in time, when you're in the house for a very long period of time, you pick up new things to do. But yes, I spent a lot of time on these issues because they're important.
So when I'm thinking about your question, kind of, I think about it as making incremental changes. And we built a house a long time ago, and a lot of our friends built houses, and we called them hippie built houses because you built this little part, and then you built a shed off here, and then you built another one off here, and then you built something off here. And so if your original house that you started with had faults, the whole thing had faults. And so your question is, are we building onto something that might have been okay to start with, but isn't okay now, or might not even have been okay to start with? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's a public policy,
Yeah.
during testimony at one point, and I won't get into what group and someone said, how did that happen? And I wanted to say, you voted for it.
Yeah.
But the reality is that you also voted on it based on information you received and those discussions. And has the landscape changed since then? The landscape has changed, and we know that. And we need to go back and assess that.
Yeah, and I guess my point in bringing this up is really that I want to make sure that we have fully illuminated this part of the challenge so that when we do make those recommendation decisions here as a task force that may ultimately lead to policy decisions adopted at the legislature, that we're making those decisions with our eyes wide open and a full understanding. Because, you know, many of us were surprised to find that the 2009 recommendations didn't get us where we thought we needed to be, sort of on a more sustainable track in the long term. Now, some of that may be because the 2009 recommendations were largely set aside and ignored as opposed to adopted by the legislature. But my hope is that among this task force, that we can have a full and honest assessment and turn over every rock and understand how we got here, as well as whether the foundation of the central, structure of our pensions is or was ever sustainable.
So I guess what I would say to that is, I think that more recommendations were done than that have been characterized in this. I don't have the report in front of me. If someone has it, the 2009 report, and I'm doing this from memory, someone can test me. There you go. Take a look at page 6. And if you want to hand that over to me, I think I can answer that.
Let's make sure we don't go too far down this.
Yeah, I don't want to go, I don't want to
that-
keep you from your plan presentation.
Sure, thank you. I believe that, and I guess I do have the wrong page, but we'll work that out. I believe that the recommendations were at a much different scale. The teachers, ADEC at that point in time was someplace in the $60 million, and we were trying to get it down into the 40s. I believe the recommendations that the actuary put together was someplace around $29-30 million. I was hoping to find that. I thought it was page 6, but I know it's at the front end. We did 20 million out of that 29-30 million of recommendations. Now, they came after the fact, through that different discussion. The scale was different, but there was a percentage that was acted on. Since 2009 and 10, the real increase in the workforce issues and the teacher system exploded in 2011. So I think that that's some of the piece, but the scale of this thing back in 10, I think they pretty much did their job. The problem is getting to your point, assumptions and real life changed since then. The investments have changed, the rate of inflation again, the workforce issues, and I keep talking about the teacher issues, but they're there in the other, in visas as well. Salary expectations. The teachers will like this. The salary expectations that are in the valuations up to now, up to 2020, teacher salaries haven't kept pace with that. On the other hand, in the state system, don't get mad at me, they've exceeded that. So you have to look at the assumptions. I would also point out that there's a fundamental issue here, which is assumptions are a guidepost. They're to help you develop your plan. In reality, it's real experience that counts. And at the end of this thing, when you get to 2038 or whatever year we might end this thing, it's going to be based on when people retired, what were the investments, what was the rate of inflation, what was the cost of living, not what we estimated. And I see some actuaries call it a guess, but what we estimated back, in 2009 and in 2010 and 11.
Thank you for your time today. I have just one question. I'm trying to remember. I think it was in one of Chris Roops's presentation that the funded status actually was on an uptick, maybe 2018, 2019, and then the assumed rate of return went from 7.5% to 7%, which I think then started to lower it down. But thinking back to Eric's point about having it get worse before it gets better, we're roughly then 11 years into it. Things started to appear that maybe they were getting better there before changing that assumed return. So maybe the system and the recommendations from 2009 actually were working and were getting us on the right track before that changed.
They were right at the time. Again, events changed, economic events changed, economic cycles changed. As I said, Brexit, different economic events, as well as workforce. that gets me back to the presentation, so thank you, Andrew. And if you take a look at page 9, this is the state system, and we provide this in our annual report every year and in the various reports we do to committee. If you go to 2007 in the state system, so right in the, this is the unfunded liability and where it is, you see that the state system was in surplus. That a negative 11 million in the funded status means that they were over by $11 million. That was 100.8%, not 108, 100.8, very fragile, but it was there. And then the Great Recession hit, and you see those numbers grow fairly substantially. So before 2007, you see some growth in the state system. And again, you were in surplus. 2008, most of the Great Recession hit in the latter part of that year, you know, the September of 08, which is part of the fiscal year 2009. So you see these downward trends. We expected it to get better, and from 7, a little bit. But what you see is the continued degrading of the numbers. And some of that we said, we got to take a look under the hood and find out what's going on. That's part of what you're doing today. But the numbers have not improved. In fact, they've gotten worse. And taking a good look under the hood on what those issues are. And we've got a piece on that a little further down. If you go to the next page, the teachers. And well, let me just, so what I did on page 10 was just show the liabilities growing, what the unfunded liability looked like and how that increased over time. You see in 2010, when we did a few fixes, it went down a little bit, but it didn't hold. The next page, page 11, is in our report, and this is the scope of where we are now. We're talking in the state system about a $225 million increase from 2020 or 19 val to the 2020 val, which again affects the 2020 budget. So we were looking, based on a mandate from the retirement boards, to provide a recommendation to you on how to bring that down to the 2019 levels. And if you recall, Representative Gannon, in our 2019 risk study, we were looking to lower it even further. We were trying to lower it from the 2019 val. That's behind us at this point in time. We're concentrating right now on trying to get to this. And the change in the ADEC was $36 million. You go to the next page, we have the similar pages for the state system, teacher system. And you see that a similar pattern that 2008 and beginning there was a tough time, getting into the 60s. Now I want to caution, and you see that little arrow on that, and it reflects a different actuarial method. This was a little mind-boggling to me. I was a deputy treasurer at the time, and we won't get into who said what, but they put in a very small amount into the ADEC versus what the actuary said. And I looked at Jeb Spalding, the treasurer, and said, boy, what did they see next year's number? It's going to look horrible. And then it didn't change. So I'm saying, why? Okay. And started to dig, and then called our actuary. And what happened was the state had in statute, and I don't know, I think it was in the 80s that someone came up with this idea, and it was called frozen initial liability. I know I'm getting into the weeds, but give me a moment. They had an outlier actuarial method. And what happened is it froze the liability. So no matter what you do, the liability was going to stay roughly where it was. And then everything went into the normal cost. So you still had that increase in the ARC, but now the ADEC, but it was masking the real unfunded liability. So when folks say we were almost there, we weren't. And a couple of pages in, because I was trying to stay with the graph process. So if you go to page 13, you see the same graph that you saw in the teacher's system, and you see the same goal, which is that $379 million increase in the unfunded liability in the 60 million. That both of those total up to the $604 million increase in unfunded liabilities and the 97 million bogey. But if you go to, I just explained page 15, so I won't do it again. That's that odd methodology. If you go to page 16, and these were in the 2005 report to the legislature, if you take a look at it, and you can't go back, those were what it was. If you take a look, and I'm going to go back to 15 because I'm having trouble reading those small graphs. it distorted it and the cost associated with it. So under the new method, the method that's correct, the method that's a standard for funding purposes and is a standard by GASB for accounting purposes, the unfunded liability in 2001 was not 93.8 million. If you use the current method, it was 315 million. And if you take a look at the funded position, you'll see that that 92.3% is actually based on the same consistent methodology, 81.1. Now, the reason that's important, if you look at that graph in the upper left, you see that the red line is the actual contributions and the blue line is the actually recommended contribution. You see the variance between them. And you see the decline if you use the EAN method. So the reality is that the numbers back then, and I remember one person, I'm not going to say names, saying, well, we didn't put as much in, but the number didn't change. So we'll worry about that down the road. It did change. You didn't measure it right. An analogy that's been used in the past is that if you go to the doctor's office and the blood pressure machine isn't working, and they take, and you say, they take that and they take your pulse and everything, and you go home, the scale's not working, and you're in perfect health, you might have different habits than if you knew it was higher. And this is part of the problem in the teacher system, that the methodology that was in statute, we immediately recommended to the General Assembly that be corrected, and you folks did that. So, or you folks did it. Yes, sir.
Beth, a question on the past underfunding. Clearly, it's been more prevalent in the teacher system, has
Yes.
had more of an impact there. But understanding that the state system was fully funded in 2007 with the assumptions at the time, that doesn't mean that all the contributions were made. Maybe if we were 108% funded, we would have been able to withstand the shock from the Great Recession a little better. I have not seen I've only been able to find the contribution histories for the state system, maybe back 15 years or so. If that is available to the treasurer's office.
It is.
I think that would be helpful.
I would say largely the state received pretty close or the amount. And the way that the state does it, they assess it as a percentage of payroll, and we tend to underestimate the payroll. So in many cases, the state actually had more than 100% of the contribution. The difference, again, is coming into the Great Recession, and then some of the assumptions, again, salaries are different than we expected. Workforce changes, the retirement incentives in 2010 and 2016 are mind-boggling to me. You made it, there was an assumption about how much the unfunded liability would go up and how much the ADEC would go up, but it would be offset by operating costs. And number one, again, that's that same property tax pension equation. But the idea was they were going to leave, I don't remember the number, Michael, but it was something around 100 positions vacant after the 300 or so. And between 2010 and 2014, the state added 543 positions. I remember that number because I talked about that many times. Now, I'm not a workforce expert. I can't tell you whether you needed those positions or not. That's not my job. But recognize that when you do those things, now you've increased the normal cost. And when you now change assumptions, that's had an impact on the unfunded liability. Not when you start, it's a normal cost, but when you change liabilities and you have these people in for that period of time, it has some impact on the overall health of the plan.
Beth, on page 16 here, it shows 2001 to 2005, looking at the actuarial recommended values versus what the contribution levels were. Do we have the historical data pre-2001, also up to 2008? I believe it was 2008 when the ADEC was being funded again fully. And
Sure.
So a second part to that question.
Yes, sorry again.
Do we know?
I get excited about talking about this stuff. I'm not happy with why we're talking about it.
Right.
But it is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but it's also, I don't want to understate the seriousness of this. It really is. And now I'll stop interrupting you. Go for it,
For all my
Andrew.
students out there, numbers are fun. People enjoy talking about them. So just thinking about that, do we have an actual dollar amount on the underfunded amount in the teacher system? And not just the dollar amount, but the lost opportunity cost of investments and returns since
Sure.
then, kind of how that
Okay.
plays into this.
Okay, so the chart on page 16 has two pieces. One was the difference between the EAN and the frozen initial liability. We did not go back further than 2001 on that because there's a cost and we wanted to get to what the sense of the funding issue. The difference between the red line and the blue line are on page 18 of the package. And you'll see, and I highlighted in yellow and put in red, the serious levels of underfunding. And we can try to calculate that. There's a little bit of a nuance. One of the folks that talked at the public hearings, I said, I don't know if he's a math teacher or not, but he should be. And he took a look at the interest rates at the time and calculated that. But there is a little nuance there as well, which is when you do the ADEC and you haven't calculated and the gains go up, you now amortize that over a period of time. It's sort of like a home equity loan on top of your mortgage, okay? And as a consequence, some of that is being repaid, but it's being repaid in that mortgage over time. That's a little more difficult to calculate. We can have a conversation if folks think that that is worth it in terms of your decision-making process, but it will cost you some money.
I would love to see that. I think it's a really important piece of information. When you're trying to put together a puzzle and you're missing a couple of pieces, it's a little frustrating to.
Yep.
to have a
And
final
again, and I do want to get back to a motion that this teacher board did on terms of the interactions between you folks and ours with respect to the actuary. And I can do that perhaps after we take I assume you're going to do a break someplace in this because you don't want to listen to me for, again, add on and add on, but
I think we're here for
yeah.
a week.
Thank you.
That's why she took the padded chair.
Okay. You're gonna do best with that, okay? All right, thank you.
Beth, can you talk a little bit more about the impact of the salary expectations or assumptions on the unfunded liability?
Sure. So an actuary will take a look at several components when they're looking at the salary as well as COLA and the like, and I'm trying to find the page in the presentation that will help with that. Page 24. And economic assumptions are interest rates, salary increases, payroll growth. As you see, that inflation's a big factor, and that number has suddenly changed post-COVID. Where, how long it stays, we'll see. That productivity is taking a look at income levels, GDP, and so on, and what the increase in productivity and what the increase in salaries are nationally. But you see that payroll growth, and they make an assumption. They make assumptions about COLA, they make assumptions about salary increases, not just payroll growth, which is that productivity side and that GDP, but what is this career, the salary scale? What is the, again, that productivity, that piece there, which is, I'll try to give you a better definition of that down the road. I've been trying to put that together with different actuarial interpretations of it and inflation. So there was a scale that's built in. And in the actuarial report, you see that scale, and it's by ages, and it also has by when you started, so years of service. At the front end, at least in the state system, you have more raises or more step increases at the front end than you do at the other. So it takes a look at all that and averages it out. In the teacher's system, those assumptions have been made in the teacher's system from 2011 to 2020. The actual salary changes for teachers has been less than that. So actual
Are you saying if I was paid more,
Mhm.
contribute more, 5% of more is more?
No, I guess what I'm saying is that it's an actuarial gain because the teachers did not have the same increases in salary that were the assumptions. Now, again, I don't know how the assumptions make sense to public policy at the local level of how much you should be paying a teacher. And by the way, I think teachers do a fantastic job, and along with social workers and a number of other, tough positions. I like teachers. What can I say? They have an incredible job and they make a real difference in future generations in terms of citizenship and their ability to be part of the economy, as do all jobs. I have a real high respect for public service. But in the case of the teacher system, those salaries increases were lower than the expectation and the assumption. In the state system, they were the other. Okay, now That doesn't mean that collective bargaining on the state system created a bad result. I'm not an expert on workforce, and I'm certainly not an expert on what the prevailing rate should be. But based on the data that the actuaries had, and based on the best estimate, they put in salary assumptions, and there's variations against it.
I'm just kind of interested in that because if the salary changes were lower than expected, like Kate was saying, that means that less money is going into the system, but it also means, I guess, at the other end, that retirees had a lower final 3 years, and maybe
Yep.
that takes precedent.
That's part of it. And also, contributions go to the normal cost. So the employee, the formula is employee contributions go to the normal cost. And then employer contributions are a combination of what's needed to complete the normal cost. How much do you need for Beth, or that 30-year-old, or Michael, or any of you, Molly? How much are we going to need in terms of, put aside for that normal cost? So employer pays a portion of the normal cost. And when you look at the ADEC, you see it's broken out between normal cost and unfunded liability. And then the balance of the employer cost goes to the unfunded liability as part of the ADEC. So yes, there's an interaction. You're going to have a different AFC, average final compensation at the end, in terms of those. But in addition to that, employee monies are directed toward the normal cost.
Well, and the reason I was asking about that is because I think it's hard to know how any given change we make is going to affect the numbers, because
Sure.
like, say, for example, that a teacher retires earlier than another teacher. Well, they're retiring on a lower salary. For the local school district, that means that there's, a lower salary presumably of an incoming teacher, but then that money that incoming young teacher is putting into the system is going to build over time.
Yes.
A much longer period of time.
Yes.
So how do we even begin to distill out how the choices we make?
Okay. So we can give you examples after we finished our report. What we did is we asked the actuary to take a look, and we gave them real people without their names and without their social security numbers. And we gave them real people, different types, that 30-year-old, that mid-career person, that person that was going to take early retirement. And we said, how is it going to affect that individual, what their retirement would look like? And we did that a number of scenarios. We can do those once you start to come up with some ideas. Or if you have a scenario you want us to test and what that does to the individual, because we think that's important to know what it does to the individual. I think that's extraordinarily important. If you want retirement security, you need to understand what the impacts were. And some people had more gains, and other people had losses. Obviously, since we were reducing the unfunded liability, there were more losses than gains in that process. But we can certainly provide that for you. So once you have a sense of what your scenario might look like, we can apply it to different folks in our system. And literally, the retirement system came up with a series. We talked to the actuary about which ones they think would be helpful. And then we gave them those real people without the names, and then they did the calculations. We can do that for you.
I just want to make sure, Beth, I'm understanding this correctly, that so back in 2009, actuaries made an assumption that teacher salary growth would be at a higher level compared to what actual real life events took place over the past decade. The teacher salaries have not grown to the point that actuaries assumed they would,
Yes.
which because of that lack of growth, it actually was in a way a gain for the system because it didn't cost as much money to the system.
That's correct. The only difference is that we did experience studies in 10, 15, 20. We did a mini one in 2017. So those assumptions have changed since 2009 and have evolved. But again, what happens at the, in terms of the whole, particularly in the teacher's side, well, actually both, you've had a lot of interaction with policy decisions around workforce, and on the state side as well. Again, I'm not going to suggest that I have no idea where those positions, those 543 positions I mentioned earlier went and how that divvied up. We need to do a better job. Again, I'm not going to do it, okay? HR will have to volunteer for this one. I'll tell Commissioner Fastigia that I just volunteered her for something. But we need to do a better job about workforce and where they're deployed. And I take a look and I see issues in some places, corrections, for instance. You have a lot of overtime costs because of the number of staff that you have there. And you can't go home and say, well, my replacement didn't come in, so I'm going home and, the folks in the facility, they just have to wait for the next crew. You can't do that. So we have overtime costs. What are the overtime costs in relationship to if you hired more individuals? Do we have the right distribution of folks? Those are questions that need to be answered, and I'm not going to answer them. You need other types of professional help, but they will bear on the decisions that are made here, because overtime gets into your average final cost, for instance. So these are really terrific questions. Thank you. Continue on.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to move up a little bit. Actual gains and losses on page 19. I'm just gonna hit the key points and then try to go through some of this. We have losses every year. I think we've talked about that. Assumptions don't actually match. And you have to retool and those over time. Some of those are in our control, some of them are not. As I said, Vermont's a great state, but we're not gonna probably change the national inflation trends, and we're certainly not gonna have an impact on what they voted in England, for instance. The Asian crisis a few years back. We don't have a control over that. And my favorite one is the Fed monetary policy, which they call taper tantrum. Tapering of the treasuries and how they're, how much they're buying, for instance, and the tantrum is the market's reaction to it. So, but we try to true up for those. And then you have different types of gains and losses, and there's a chart in here we'll get to momentarily on those. The experience study, the recommendation, moving from 5 to 3 years, we concurred with that. I think that we were talking in the same direction. That's great when all minds are working in the same direction. I think that all of us in the room can agree that that's helpful. We'll get to the patterns. I think the last comment, and I quoted directly from a memo from Siegel. Actual assumptions are used to estimate the plan's future benefits and payments, but they do not determine outcomes. Ultimately, the outcome will be how much did you earn? How much did you contribute? What were the salary changes? How much did you get in retirement? The assumptions are is a planning tool. They help us get there. They help us understand the scope of the issue if things don't go the way what it looks like if they do go that way, what the assumptions will look like, and how bad is our plan funded position, and what do we need to do to correct it. But assumptions also are just that. They're assumptions, they're guideposts, they're for planning purposes. Real behaviors make the difference and ultimately where we come through on this. So page 20 is the cumulative losses in the visa system. Now you notice I went to 2007. Remember I pointed out that in 2007, that's when you started to see some changes in terms of the impact that the change in methodology had in terms of mostly the state teachers, but it did have some minor impact on the state, but since they were funding it, it wasn't as big a deal. And then I wanted to get what post-recession looks like. Now, 2011 is mostly post-recession, but in the case of investments, we smooth those over a 5-year period. So if you take a look at 08 and 09 being your biggest chunk of change in terms of losses, if over a 5-year period, you're still going to have those monies into 2013 or so. So if you take a look at this, again, the big ticket items for the state system, I do need to put my glasses on for this. If you take a look at the positive numbers, so retirement gains and losses is a part of it. I think the retirement incentive is a part of that. You take a look at the other gains and losses, which would probably include the retirement as well, plus changes in the way benefits were calculated and some of the changes in the systems over time. 95, you take a look at, again, I got to do this with the paper here. It's salary, as I just said, that 95 million. You take a look at investment gains and losses were about 56 million. Some of that again being phased in from the recession. Mortality, people were living longer. We had to make those changes. So you see, we went from 293 million in unfunded liability to $1.04 billion. And these are the components of what made it go up and down. If you look at the teacher system, which is page 21, and this, by the way, is what you should be looking at to the questions that you folks have had. What are the drivers and what do you have in terms of ability to influence those drivers? You're not going to influence mortality, that Vermont's a great state to live in, a healthy state. But you can have an influence on retirement experience, for instance. And what are we doing that incentivizes people to retire? That's an issue. Again, the retirement incentives worked away from a good pension system. They helped on the operating side, but there has to be balance. On the teachers system, yes.
I'm not sure if this is a legitimate question or not, and I don't think it's necessarily a question for you, but in terms of what we can control and what we can't control. So we can only make decisions about the retirement funds and the benefits and the contributions and stuff. But we can't control what local decisions are made. I mean, talking about the teachers fund now, not the state employees fund. But we have no control over those decisions. And so how do we determine how those decisions might impact or offset or reverse any decisions we make? And I don't know. I just think that's just something that we need to address. It's not necessarily for you, but it is something that's out of our control that does impact this.
I think there are a couple of pieces to that. I remember way back, and I remember talking to Representative Swaney about this, and the disconnect, because it's local, and they set the salary levels, they set the make the decisions there. But we made the decisions about appropriations. And I think the disconnect was, well, we don't have control over this. And there was something in the mindset that said, if we're going to skimp on something, it's going to be that because we don't have control over the decisions that are impacting this. That was a mistake. But I heard that. And I don't know if every legislator or every government official or every board member or every member of the treasurer's office at the time had that perspective. But because we don't have decision-making around the policy pieces around many of those, not all, you have that disconnect, and that's where it's the only thing I can think of in terms of why you underfunded one versus the other. So I think that that's part of it, but you do have some impact on, through education policy and education funding on what decisions are made at the local level, whether it's, the changes that were made with Act 46, or whether there are changes that are made in terms of, someone's not gonna like the word I'm about to use, but mandates about property tax increases. Those things have an impact. Whether or not the retirement incentives that were happening, and I believe to some extent are still happening for teachers, whether or not there should be a cost piece to the state when you push up the benefits, and whether that's through the education fund. I just hit one of the third rails by saying that, but there are ways that you can address it. And I think that it's important to take a look at what's driving the teachers. And if you look at it, $319 million of the changes were turnover, which is, members and terminations and staffing issues at the local level. And then you take a look at retirements, gains and losses combined, and that's on the next page. I was pretty close, 39%, the increase, the $482 million related to that. We broke these out a little differently, and that's not, I think the JFO report aggregated the demographics, and we thought breaking them out would be helpful. And by the way, their report, I reconciled it to ours, and it's 100% correct. Okay, so thank you in terms of those numbers. But I had the reconciliation back here if anybody wanted to look at it. But 39% of the increase in liabilities is related to that. Those two items, they're offset by salary, they're offset by other pieces, but the reality is that's a big chunk of change. And what can you do in policy decisions that have an impact on it?
And I guess if I were a current teacher paying into the teacher retirement system and understanding the impact that these decisions have on the health of my fund, I would be rightfully wanting to concentrate on that. And I hope that we will continue to drill down on that to understand the extent to which the advantage of retiring a high salary teacher to the local school district may be great for the local school district's bottom line. It may not be great for the remaining teachers' retirement system.
So what I would say to you is right on. That's exactly the point. And looking at this thing as a totality, as opposed to, that division.
And who should bear that? Who should bear the cost of that? Because right now,
Absolutely.
it is the teacher retirement fund that's bearing the cost of
Exactly.
that, not the local school district.
I'm hitting on that third rail again and some really tough decisions around that, but it is something that you
Getting all
need
the
to look at.
information out on the table. We
You
have
got
to
it.
Talk about this.
And I just wanted to add to that, it's interesting when you juxtapose it with I don't know how many people here have seen the article in Vermont Digger that came out last night about teacher shortages, and a county in west of Rutland was hiring over 25% of their staff this summer.
Yep.
So talk about teacher turnover,
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a big piece for us. And we try to get at this with the actuaries. When Act 46 and you had school consolidation, if you don't have a contract at the end of the year, you end up in an actuarial bucket called inactive. And we did, trying to work through that. So what we did is we walked through and took a look historically, did those teachers that did not have a contract get picked up in a school, and we're able to resolve some of that. But those are big issues. And looking at that, it's tough. But I would recommend getting to your point that you take a look under the hood and look at what you can do here.
So we're gonna do some work, sorry, Eric, we're gonna do some work on demographics this afternoon, and we've got HR coming in to talk about the demographics of the state workforce, but it's more difficult to get a fine grain understanding of the demographics of the teacher workforce. Because we're sort of, we need to look at data, from the retirement office or from the teacher health insurance office as sort of a proxy for that. And I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if there are other sources
Sure.
of being able to understand, how
Mhm.
many early retirements were offered, what was the benefit that was offered to teachers, either across a district or across the state. Because I think we should understand what that has looked like historically.
Yes.
And assume that we want to have a better understanding of that going forward, to know its
Sure.
impact to this teacher retirement.
Would
fund.
AOE have that at all, or?
I asked Jeff way back about this, and we ended up with some anecdotal data, which is described on page 23. But we think that we need to take a good look at the contracts as well. Excuse me. Let me find, yes. So this was based on some communication between Jeff and myself back in 2017. And we brought some of this, and I think I used, it's anecdotal. We know some schools, we don't have a full picture. I think the testimony I had was, I went to a bookstore and the person behind the desk said, "I'm a teacher, retiree now. Thank you for the good service from your office." And it's fantastic. Those people do a great job. But with the retirement deal I got, I couldn't pass it up. Okay. And I started to say to myself, well, what's going on here? And how many of those are happening? We know in the state system because we're a single employer, but we don't know what's happening here. So back in 17, the rough estimate that we had was slightly less than 50% of the schools have some type of process. It may fluctuate. Jeff's gut feeling, if I can speak for you, Jeff, is that there's less of that now than there are. But when we talk to retirees, we do hear, well, I have to make a decision about retirement because I have, whether I get this incentive or not. So we don't know. There's no current data. We are going to look and see if we can get contracts from different schools and see if we can get some sense of what those contracts are, where they are provisions. Some of them are ad hoc. It's not in a contract, some of them are contractually, and try to take a look and see if we can get a handle at least on where it's happening, and then maybe ask the LEA of the school to give us some more information. We did see some geography in this. And that, at least on the materials, I really appreciate Jeff getting this to us. During the southern part of the state has less of these than the mid part of the state. But we can take a look at contracts, get some idea of what's going on, but that's going to take some work. But I think it's work that would be well suited to getting to the solutions.
I just want to bring something up
Sure.
because you've accurately reflected this on page 22. And I just want to make sure that everyone hears this because I've been getting a lot of communications from folks. And the first thing they say is that you need to fully fund the pension every year. And I tell them we have been since 2007, both sides.
Yeah.
However, this does accurately reflect that the healthcare, the OPEB, for the
Absolutely.
teachers was actually coming out of the corpus, even though we fully funded the pension
Yep.
every year.
Absolutely.
The corpus of the fund was paying for OPEB. Now,
Yes.
until somebody named Ron Hubert and you and a couple of others got together in 2015. and
Ron,
fixed
yes.
it.
He went through every amortization table we had to check them, and he told us we were right. But it was an
But
interesting
there was the
process.
impetus right there and
Yep.
what really got going to finally turn it into what is now termed a pay-out. You know, where we're not pulling money out of the corpus of the fund to pay for OPEB. It's actually
Yep.
coming out of operating funds. of the
Right.
state.
You're gonna love the number
I
on
just
that.
wanted to put that
Yep.
because people have, it's what I've been, the first comment I've
Yep.
been hearing.
Yep.
You're not fully funding them. We
Exactly.
all are.
Go to page 17, and I agree mostly in principle. I have a few nuances with, some of the discussion that's happened on this and reports that you received. It had no impact on the change from 2020 to 2021 for the unfunded liability, and no impact on the ADEC. It did, however, lower the levels coming in Great Recession, and frankly, the ability to recover when you're in a lower funded position. And your point, the 175 million of 2000 from 2007 to 2020. Now, healthcare numbers, I can get numbers from 2001 up. The state went through a change. Michael, you probably heard stories about vision. Actually, Michael in the auditor's office wrote an audit report about what I would call the fiasco in implementation. But I can get numbers from 2001 and try to estimate the impact. But it does have an impact on the ADEC still because of that mortgage situation. But you're absolutely right.
But the point I
Yep.
want to make is we didn't underfund it.
Yep.
We were pulling funding out of it.
Yes.
In order to pay for it. We didn't-
Exactly.
We did not underfund it from
Yep.
2007 going forward.
Yes.
I've been on that committee upstairs since for the last 10
Yep.
years, and we have dogged it and determined it, funded fully.
Absolutely.
The ARC and now the ADEC.
Well, yeah, but we're only funding in the pension system. We're not funding the OPEB on a pre-funding basis.
The OPEB
Yep.
is all
Yep.
taken.
And you're gonna see that I'm gonna
We're
make a
paying that too.
big push for that.
I just want to, because people don't.
Yeah.
They don't understand.
Okay, so the change we made to go to PayGo instead of putting it on our credit card, which is essentially what you're going to do, is mind-boggling. It was a $480 million benefit to the system, and to lower the cost for taxpayers. And when I say taxpayers, by the way, I should say other taxpayers when I'm referring to employee groups, because 78% of employees in the state system that retire reside in Vermont, pay taxes in Vermont. 75% of the teachers. The myth that they all run to Florida is just wrong, okay? Some people live, New Hampshire, Florida's next, New Hampshire's next after that. And some people, I have a staff person that lives in New Hampshire, so my presumption is at retirement, he's probably gonna continue to live in New Hampshire. He should come to the great state of Vermont. But the reality is that $480 million by making that change in 2014, you enacted it and it was implemented in 2015. It was one of the highlights of our office in terms of working with you. And yes, Ron went through those piece by piece with us. It was an arduous process, but it was worth every penny. So, and it was a lot of pennies.
Eric has a question.
Sure.
So I think this has been a really helpful dialogue in terms of what's driving some of what we're seeing. And I want to dig in on the turnover piece a little bit, just so I'm understanding it correctly. So when we think about solutions, we can tailor them to the drivers. Net turnover being a driver of unfunded liability, that I assume that is people leaving sooner than you actuarially assumed they would continue in the workforce.
It's behavior changes. Retirements are a little easier to understand because, and this is not the case in everyone. Everybody says you're going to lose a whole people and that's going to impact the system. Yes, it will impact the system, but not everyone who retires is an actuarial gain. Some folks are, some aren't. When you terminate or you have turnover, you're hired and rehired, and those are a little more ambiguous in terms of the impact from person to person, but clearly it has an impact, and we can dig deeper under. I haven't dug enough under the whole under the hood there. We can dig deeper on that.
Thank you.
This might be going back maybe 10 minutes now, but it's just a thought that's been percolating in my mind. So thank you for bearing with me on this. Just trying to make sure I understand the idea that when locals offer an incentive for a teacher to retire, it helps the local budget, which helps the local taxpayers there. However, it is a drain on the pension system because people are retiring earlier, so they're taking their pensions earlier. However, at the same time, if teachers work longer, it puts more burden on the local budgets and less of a burden on the pension system.
That's the look at it and balance, the holistic approach, instead of, pressing the balloon at one end, taking a look at the whole thing. Now, the people that retire that are actuarial gains, because a lot of folks, when they get to their more mature age, okay, they're more, some of them are maxed out on their steps. Some of them, they're going to get cost of living adjustments, but we refer to them as actuarial gains to the system. I was at a retirement party for someone, and I remember I got up and called him an actuarial gain, and at least Suzanne Young understood what I was saying. But not everybody, but many, okay? So when you do that, you end up putting pressure. They're retiring early, so you're paying out dollars. You lose that actuarial gain that they have in terms of their salary position. And so it has an impact directly there. Again, the other one is a little more ambiguous in terms of the decisions that impact that, but we will get more information for you.
Thank you. And it feels like it kind of speaks to the complexity of all of our considerations.
Yes.
Thinking about, okay, well, if we do make this change, how that impacts human behavior. And thinking about if teachers who are at their bottom step think their max amount are staying for extra time, how that forces local school districts into making difficult choices. I think I've heard repeatedly over and over, the easiest way to trim a budget is by cutting people.
Absolutely.
Which of course, cutting teachers really has a terrible consequence on the education of our students and our communities and the impact they are and the services that we can provide. So it really does speak to all those pieces we need to consider when making a decision.
Absolutely, absolutely. It this is complex, but you're asking the right questions in this. So thank you.
Just a follow-up to Andrew's question. I'm glad he asked it because that was a question I had. Is there anything on the front end of a teacher's career in terms of turnover within the first 5 years of the best before the vesting period that's impacting this number as well?
I'd have to go look at the benefit. We made some changes to that in the teacher system in 2009, so that when you left, we calculated an actuarial impact of that and adjusted for that in terms of, Michael, you remembering this? There's a, yeah, but I'm, the individual, when they leave, they get their money plus a percentage. And we try to calculate that to make it actuarially neutral, I believe, but we need to take a look at that, whether those assumptions hold. I'm now getting into, I'm thinking about the, you have it someplace in your materials, the group plan matrix. I'm a little foggy on this one and I'm gonna have to follow up.
When can we expect to see updated numbers for the FY21 closeout and increased gains from the 24% return?
Sure. So we do our evaluation process, and this is where we are going to have some competing needs for actuarial services. And I talked to the actuaries the other day, and said, we're gonna need to ramp up. Because we anticipate a request from you folks, and we're gonna need to ramp up. Now, the problem with ramping up, by the way, I'm gonna get to your question in a second. The problem with ramping up is that you need people that are also experienced in our system. So, so they don't have to get from 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds or whatever it might be. So that's going to be an issue. The boards did vote to say that that they're more than happy to use, this is the teacher board, yours, to share our services, but they also want to make sure that our statutory requirements are met. Now, what happens, so this gets to your when. So what happens is we're finishing up right now, I think Monday, trying to get people onboarded that retired in June. The numbers so far are a little less on the teacher system than last year. We won't have final numbers to Monday. And again, people can retire after that too, but that's kind of a cutoff point that we're looking at. Then we close the system around mid-July. We've got our June numbers and what's happened in the year. We do some census work ourselves. The IT department works and we try to clean it up. On August 30th, we send that to the actuary, okay? And then they do a cleanup. So all through the month of September, they are doing cleanup on our numbers. They're looking and saying, that salary increase doesn't make a lot of sense to me. In the teacher system, for instance, the AFC is limited. The amount that you can count toward the AFC is 10% in those last 3 years, and anything above that isn't counted. So there are different nuances. We got to go through that. While they're doing that, our folks are doing the financial statements, and we do all of the financial reporting that's sent to the auditors that's included in the state's annual comprehensive report. And that gets sent to the actuary on 9/30, okay? And then we combine those things and they do a report at the end of October. So we won't know the impact to October. Now, there's a page in there that shows how they smooth it. So you're not gonna, the 24% is great. We're happy with it. It exceeds our 1, 3, 5, 10, and maybe 15-year, I don't remember, rate of return expectation. Those are volatile. I won't say what organization, but an organization that was pushing an agenda would take the worst possible time, the Great Recession, and put it there. You know who I'm talking about. But so it can be endpoint sensitive when you take it in terms of the economic cycles. But that 24% is great. But what's going to happen is that there's a difference right now between the actuarial and the market value. It's about 105% roughly. So you're going to need to make up that first. And then we smooth it over a 5-year period. So I took a shot at that the other day, and I need to kind of retool it a little bit, but you're not going to get what $1.1 billion is what we collected. So this year our earnings are just over $1.1 billion. The teacher system gets roughly 42% of that. The state system gets roughly 42%, and the remainder goes to 16%, if I'm doing the math right, to the municipal system. So 42% of that, so you're talking, $460 million. You're going to get that. But again, part of it is to pay off the difference between those, and part of it will be smoothed over 5 years. And you say, why do we smooth it? Because if you use market value, you folks could never do a budget, because 1 year, when you have a bad year, you're going to have to put in a whole bunch more. Then the next year it goes up. We used to have that problem with debt service, and as they bring up his name, Jim Reardon would say, how come it was this year and this year, everybody loved it when the debt service went down, but they weren't too happy the next year went up. So you try to smooth it for appropriation purposes. During the Great Recession, some folks decided that one way to handle that was to push out their 5-year smoothing to 10 years so that there was less impact on the Great Recession. Unfortunately, when you get the snapback, and the increases, they also had trouble there. So some of them were trying to get the best of both worlds, 10 and then switch it back to 5 or something. So it won't all be there. We won't know till October. I'm not prepared to say the number. I want to kind of walk it through with the actuary. I replicated their process that they used for the prior year and came within $3 million, which isn't too bad. I want to make sure that I'm doing it correctly this year and talk to an actuary about it. So before I hand out even an estimate, I want to have that conversation.
This one will be quick, I promise.
Yes.
knowing that you were saying we can't get that report until October, but our task force is putting out the initial report in October. I think having that the past fiscal year returns just as a consideration for us for any decision making. What are the chances we could get that earlier than October?
Well, if I talk just the investment piece alone, and that smoothing, if I talk to the actuaries and their gain in terms of the process that I started to, again, replicate what they've done and see if I can get close. And they will nuance it. I mean, they will take whatever I do and say, you forgot this, you add this, da, 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 you know. But when we finish that process, we may be able to give you something a little further down the road.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind that that's just that piece. Your other gains and losses, how we do in mortality, how we do in retirements, we have no idea. But getting to page 24 and 25, I'll go to page 25. This is what you're going to use for inflation. And if you see their assumptions are 2.4 per year and 1.35. One of them gets half of it, one of them gets full. Last year, the inflation rates for the teachers, for instance, was 0 for Group A and 1% for Group B and C. Group B and C, I believe, get 50% of the COLA up to a ceiling of 5, but a minimum of 1%. Group A gets the full COLA, but they don't round up to a minimum of 1. That number is going to go up one way or the other. If you take a look where that arrow is, 4.6% is the number. They may adjust it because they do go back and adjust these, but that's going to be an actuarial loss. So you got a gain on the investment side. You're going to have a loss here, or at least at best, less gain than you had last year. And then you've got the other pieces that I can't even begin to, I can't tell you what the behaviors of state employees or teachers are. I know my behaviors, but I don't know everybody else's. So help?
Yes.
Okay. So that gets us back onto this. Again, I'm going to skip through most of the experience study because we've done that. I did want to go to page 27. This was in our report. This came from the actuaries. This is on our report to you on January 15th. And it showed you, again, that 216 million was directly related to the experience study. And then in the case of the state system, another 8.2 million based on the valuation, getting you up to that 225 million. I really wanted to get to a better sense of what the pieces were. So in the next page, and this will be some time to digest, so I'll just explain it. And unless you have questions, I can attempt to answer. But you see that we broke this out to just a mortality, then mortality and turnover, then turnover and all other demographics, and then just the interest. Because when you look at their report, they had roughly, I think, Chris, the number for all economic was around 157 million. Yeah. And we broke it out and said, okay, how much of it is inflation versus investments? So we have and since inflation and COLA, which is an economic assumption, not a demographic, the COLA was a gain, you were masking the true cost of the investment. So we put that into this to this analysis. So you'll see again on the items that, and we did this with the actuary did this, to be very candid, based on our discussions back and forth. So you get a better feel for those pieces that kind of get lumped together in the experience study, and the same with the teacher system. And I won't go any further on that today unless you really want to have that conversation. But we can come back with any questions, and I'm looking over at Andrew and he's looking at that chart. I have a suspicion that I might have some questions from you and from Eric and all of you. People, all of you have been asking terrific questions today, and I've been spending years talking to Representative Fagan about retirement. I mean, he's never bored with the conversation. He really, he's really into it as well. So folks here, you do a great job. You're informed, and that's great. Investments, I'm going to touch on this briefly because this, I'm not the chair of VPIC. And in fact, we are moving forward, just to let you know, on a lot of the changes pre the report. The meeting we have next week, I plan on resigning as vice chair and asking an employee representative to be the vice chair. That's my recommendation. The board could vote for anybody they want. I have one vote. I think that that's helpful. I have asked to continue to be involved in the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That's something that's near and dear to my heart. we get involved in those issues in our office as well. Clean water comes to mind, our involvement in the Global Warming Solutions Act and some of our testimony there. But I think, and we're talking about moving them in terms of space. We're talking about some of the functions, so we are moving fairly quickly on that, which is good. But long-term view, something, I said roughly 60 to 62%, it's really closer to 62% of what's paid out to a retiree. That dollar you pay is from investments. 24.62, $1.14 billion, good numbers. You see my good news, but investments are not going to solve the problem in and of themselves. You still need to take a look at the structural changes. Expect some losses from COLA, which we just said, and it's too early for me to have any idea on what those others will look like. The second page is the chart Tom Galanka provided to you your last meeting. However, it's been updated to the 24.6. The next chart, and this gets to why investment rate of returns, because there's a disconnect. Folks think that the investment rate of return is going down because they're not getting the investments that they should. That is simply not the case. If you take a look at the chart that you had in the beginning, again, economic cycles, I'll go back to that one that Tom sent out. Whoa. You see the red line, red or orange, that's what the actual assumed rate of return is, and you're above and below it. That's what markets do. You have up years, you have down years. But you see the cycle and where we are. And by the way, Tom pointed this out to me and to you folks in testimony. You see those big jumps back in the 80s and 90s? That would have been a great time to have not underfunded your pensions. So we do have ups and downs. That's what you expect in a cycle. And over in the corner are some of the more important market events, or more significant, not important. The next page is from NASRA. And, Chris, you know that chart that you had in there? They do that every year, and that thing makes me dizzy, okay? You like that chart, okay.
I know the chart you're talking about. It took me a while to wrap my head around that, but I do like it now.
Yeah, well, there you go.
It is busy though.
Yeah, it is busy, and I actually have that chart over a number of years, so I can provide that. But NASRA did this chart that just showed it in simple line graph, what the averages were. And look at inflation. That's driving the reduction in the rate of return. Getting back to the point I made earlier, the rate of return assumption helps you plan, but actual investment return will ultimately, just like actual retirements, actual behaviors, actual inflation are going to determine where you end up in this thing. You do your best with the assumptions, but the inflation is doing this. Now, I have no idea what it's going to look like down the road. I'm concerned about this 1 year. Is it a blip? Or is it a sign that inflation is going up? We'll have to wait and see. But this chart shows you that. And up on the top, I put where we were at approximately those times. So back in 2002, we were at 8%. The average was at 8.5. We were above that in 2005. We made what I think was not the best move in 2005. We looked and said, we just created VPIC. So let's push up our return assumption a little bit. And that disconnect between what VPIC does and the assumption was not there. I think that you see that trend down, and at this point, we're at 7%, 2019. If you go to the next page, the average as of May, now they update this all the time, so there's a July number. I haven't gone back to look at it. The mean is 7.13. The median is 7, and we're at 7%. So just thought I'd point that out. The question is our smoothing in line with what other folks do? And as I said, during the Great Recession, some folks played with that a little bit, but it is. Majority are in that 5-year period. We're in that we have 5 years. And so it looks to me like those assumptions are reasonable and well within the range. The other piece of this, and I'm almost done, folks, believe it or not. And I did this a little different than Chris. I think you were trying to look more at cash flows. And I was looking at audited operating results. And it gets very complicated because, you can't invest in accrual. I guess you can if you do some things on the margin in your own life, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that for a pension fund. But so the blue thing is, the blue line is the amount of sources of funds. And we have a more detailed in our annual reports of what makes up those employer, investment income. And then the orange number or line is the actual application, paying of benefits, administrative expenses and the like. And you see that all across in the VSERS, the payment of out the door is higher than the amount that's coming in. Now, you want that to some degree. The purpose of having a pension plan is that you can get the value of investments to pay for those instead of taxpayer dollars. So you want that to some degree, but the bar is a little bit, the unfunded liability is a little bit skewed, a lot skewed actually. But the assumption, you know, someone was surprised when we said that, you know, that you're taking money out of the fund. Your corpus is going up. You know, your balance in the fund needs to go up. But the idea is that you're using investment dollars to pay for some of this, but you want the corpus to go up. You had a chart in there that I didn't include here, Chris, but you see that generally it's going up 2001, 2, and obviously 2008 wasn't a good year, but that pattern. VSTERS has the same pattern. And you see that they had some bumps in 2013 and 14. Some of that may be the teacher piece. I was trying to think of why last night, but getting to your point, Representative Fagan, that's, you know, that might be that, and we solved it around 15. The difference is VEMR's. VEMR's is a young fund, okay, relatively new. And you say 1974 is new, but if you go back to the 40s for the other funds, they are more mature and in terms of their process. So in the front end, you're collecting more, with the understanding that down the road, you're going to use those dollars. And you see all the way across that this is a cash positive fund. Okay, I put it in just to explain that. It's, you know, we're not concentrating on that. Although you will see in 2009, is that 8, this was something that was done. I was a deputy at the time, but I spoke against it. They were in such a great funding position. They said, we're going to take some money and we're going to put it into like a cafeteria fund for healthcare. So you can't take it out of the corpus of the fund. That's not legal. But the contributions coming in, they made a statutory change that said these are going to go toward healthcare. And then the Great Recession hit. Okay. And and once you put it into the healthcare, it's an irrevocable fund. So, but they haven't done it since, but that money is still there. Getting to the next page, this is the most common equation that people cite. Eric is saying yes in his reading. Chris is saying yes in his reading. All of you that have done with pensions. So it's, you know, that it's contributions plus investment income equal benefits paid plus expenses. That's what you want to see. Crossover, when this equation isn't working, you have a crossover event. GASB calculates that for accounting reports. It's not surprising that New Jersey had a crossover event, okay? A couple of other states, but we do not have a crossover event at this point in time. We continue down the road, we could, but even more important, even before you get to the crossover point, you're gonna reach a critical juncture where the legislature, when the governor and others are gonna say, taxpayers are gonna say, we can't do this anymore. When you get to that $500 million, okay, you can't do this anymore, and you end up not paying it, or you end up creating systems that do not provide retirement security. So that tipping point is why I'm so concerned about this, because I want those next generations to have the opportunity for retirement security. Now you're saying, well, you're also cutting benefits in some of your proposals. There has to be that balancing, because you want to have retired, you know, if they had done some of the changes in Social Security a little earlier, they'd be in less bad. Is that a way to say it? Not in the same situation they are now. So, as all of us, I'm probably not going to hit that tipping point there, because I'm a little older, but that 30-year-old is definitely going to have some concerns about that, unless Congress acts. Yes.
Beth, before we leave investments, I apologize, this might not be the best question for you, it might be better suited for Tom, but has there been a look back at all in terms of our investment strategies when
Yes.
our funds may have underperformed? I think
Yeah.
BPIC is doing all
Yep.
all the right things right
Yep.
now, but just in terms of learning from
Yep.
past performance, I'm just curious. if
Big
we look
time.
back.
Big time. And I think
Okay.
that one of the things that was helpful in Act 75 is that they put some pieces in there that I think we were doing already, to be very candid. We did not have them streamlined into one area for transparency. We had it all out there, but it's, trying to navigate websites can be a little rough. So trying to do that, trying to also create a communication around it to employees, those are good things. But the practices that we've had were things that we were already moving on for the last 5 years. And I got to give Tom an incredible amount of credit for this and the committee. If you took a look back to 2010, what our investment lineup looked like, I don't believe we have even one manager that we had back then. And our structure is different. We have some downside protection. I believe, and I used to say this at committee meetings, it was a difference that I had with some, I won't say who, I should not be doing this, I apologize, that we had more downside risk. Now, some of that was legitimate coming out of the Great Recession. You didn't, especially the teacher system, it was so badly funded that it couldn't take another hit, to be very candid. So you had to have downside protection. I think we had just a tad too much. And we're trying to have the balance between growth funds and downside protections and inflation protection. Real estate is a great, at least pre-COVID, is a great inflation protection. At one point, I don't know how we ended up there, but we had commodities in there.
I went ballistic with you.
You did.
When I found that out.
Yep, and
You assured me they were gonna get out of it.
and we did, because that was assumed to be, and depending on who you talk to, including your investment consultants, that's a great inflation buffer. I think that in hyperinflation, that might work. Doesn't work with regular inflation. And we got the heck out of it. And I think that was an incredibly good move. So all of the things that we've changed, I think, are to the good. I know that Representative Fagan has spent a lot of time going over things. I think you're happy with the direction we're going. And I know Representative Gannon, you spent some time with our investment folks. I'm not the person you should be talking about this, particularly now since Tom is the chair. VPIC is spinning off into its own entity, but we've made some incredible changes that I think are very good. Again, I think downside risk was important. I just thought we were a tad too far there. And so in boom markets, we didn't do as well. In down markets, we did incredibly well. But if you look at the market, overall, it's moving up. So you want to have a little bit more upside gains than downside protection. I think we've made that change. I think I'm at the one last thing is OPEB.
Yeah, and
So we have about 10 minutes before our noon break, and we
Okay.
plowed through without a morning break. My apologies.
Yep.
We usually try to put a break in to let people get up and
you're
move
kinder
around.
about that than I am.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do this one in 7 minutes. How's that? Okay. Fund the darn thing. Okay.
We're done.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Lunch break.
We have presented pre-funding of proposals. We've talked about this since 2014 in the presentations we've made to GovOps, to appropriations, to Ways and Means, to finance, okay? And 2019, we submitted a very good formal proposal on this. And then again, several times in 2020, 2021. The bottom line is just like in a pension system. If you pre-fund, you get to use those investment earnings to pay for healthcare. If you don't, what happens is that you're paying for dollar with tax dollars. And looking at the chart, I'll go past page 42, looking at the chart that we presented last year. And that's based on interest rates that were in place last year for treasuries. Actually, you have to use by law, the 20-year AA bond rate, not treasury, bond rate that's published in the Bond Buyer and other places. Using that, if you pre-funded, you would be saving in the teacher's plan $821 million over time. And the auditors and the actuaries would allow you to book this right away, which really does a lot for your balance sheet. And you start earning those dollars over time because you're investing those dollars. To me, it just blows my mind that we're not there, to be very honest. And someone said, we don't want to be here in 10 years, on the pension side, back here at the table. You are going to be back here at the table on this thing till you solve it. Okay, we need to deal with this now. The numbers for the teacher system, the amount of money you need to put in is fairly fairly modest. The state system, it's a bigger lift, but with the revenue numbers that you had this year and the statutory piece that says that 50% of any monies after surplus monies, after filling your mandatory and your reserves, 50% of that goes. My guess is, actually, I know the number, but it's someplace around $50 million is going to go back into the kitty for the state healthcare plan. And we may be able to take a look at those numbers and do a little better job. It's a heavier lift, but you got to get to the lift because we're talking $1.6 billion. We need to do it. We need to do it now. And we don't want to be here in 10 years saying, how did this help? Now, if you look at, there's a chart in here at the end that has some of the initiatives that we've done. At least I think it's here. Maybe I didn't put it in. We need to, we've done a lot on the liability side. We've done changes, tiered healthcare, so you have to work longer to get a subsidy. And that subsidy changes over time. Those things have added a lot of savings to it. And Michael, I'm going to be careful here, but we will be announcing a change that will actually enhance benefits and lower the premiums for one of the systems. And we'll be announcing that in early August, I hope. I can't give you any more details.
Of it at our August
You
4th
got
meeting.
it, you got it. Because we can't get ahead of the contracting process and the like, but it's a substantial decrease in premiums. It will impact the OPEB over time, which is a good thing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pre-fund, you still need to do it. But since it will be effective in January, it won't be, a full year and then the next year. So if you ask me how much it's going to impact the OPEB, we're not there yet. And that ends my presentation, except for.
We're not
what is-
going to talk about that.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I wasn't talking about it. I
Oh.
was asking.
Oh, okay.
I'll ask them.
Yeah,
Okay.
I had said that we wouldn't entertain any conversation about that because it's still in negotiations.
About the.
Right, no, I think she wants to ask a question about
No, I
the
wasn't
presentation
asking-
as a whole.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I thought you were going to, I thought, sorry, Leona. Don't ask your question.
So much for that part of
No,
the
no, no.
beginning about,
No,
the.
I
know.
I was
I'm just
surprised that
having
she
fun
even
with
brought
you.
it up. So I
Yeah.
just.
Senator, I'm just
Okay.
having a little fun with you, so
Yeah,
hey.
no, I just.
And again, I
didn't wanna
recognize the
go ahead of
seriousness.
that because I already promised that I wouldn't, but go ahead with your question, Leona.
There you go.
We try to remember what it was.
Okay.
So, looking at the OPEB, we've discussed and looked at a lot of it around pre-funding. Is it the upfront cost that has been the biggest?
If you take a look at the state's, the teacher system, go back to that chart. We were
Yeah.
talking about, the premium was 41.8 million
Yeah.
as it exists now. We were talking about 13.3 and 6 million, as a starting principal. So we were talking, 20 million bucks, okay?
Yeah.
And then we said for the next 3 years, the premium would have to increase, 3 or 4 years, I think it's 3 now, would have to increase at 10% increments. So you would have to put in 10% over the premium, which
Yeah.
isn't a ton of money. And then 3% thereafter, which is close to the rate of inflation, might be less than the rate of inflation down the road, and you get to pre-funding. The state system is a bigger lift because it, while it has some money in the kitty, because we had 50 some odd million already, and with this other, we'll have about 100 million in the kitty to help with this. The numbers and the premiums and the costs are higher. And I know you've asked me several times to get into, what some of the differences are. I know that there's a difference between spousal and family care, and the tiers are a little different. But we have more interaction on the teacher side. Healthcare on the state side is part of collective bargaining. Basically, whatever the state, the active employees get, they get in retirement, the benefit structure. We don't have as much visibility into that under the hood. But I know that I saw Representative Gannon say, well, that's still money. But when you're talking about the power of investing, that was a nice chart that you had in yours, power of compound interest. I think it's time to do it. And the time to do it is now.
Thank you.
Sorry, Leona.
Well, actually, the time to do it was 3 years ago, but hey.
I have a brief There's a request or a question about process. So several of us asked questions looking for information. What's our process of recording these so that we get that information? Thinking about getting that ballpark figure you're working on for October.
Yeah.
Also, I had the question about the impact on the unfunded funds, where that would be
Yeah.
now. What's our
We'll
process?
add it to that list of
Okay.
things that we need, that
Gotcha.
we've been asked.
But someone's writing it
Yeah.
down.
I think
I
that
didn't write those down. I hope you did when you asked. them.
Okay.
if you get those over to me, we will do that.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to
Okay.
defer to the chairs about how you do that, whether you streamline it and get it over to us. And again, we've asked in that motion that was made, and I think it's consistent with the board, teachers board, that everything come through one source, for instance, JFO to us. We do not want 10 people calling and diffuse, and even worse, calling the actuary at, a fairly high, cost per hour, asking the same question or a variation of a theme. I remember when I was a deputy, we had one member of one of the boards, the folks in here know exactly who I'm talking about, okay? I think there's a smile behind there, that would call the actuary directly. And I finally had to say, you can't do that because you just cost us and we were already doing this. We need to have some control over that process. So it's up to the chair how that's communicated to us.
I think that at the end, when we have our discussion at the end of today, we'll make sure that we have all of those things on the list and add them to the list that we've already started, and then figure out when we're going to put them, when we're going to get them.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just want to make sure, I wasn't sure if somebody had the assigned task of recording these types of questions there.
Well,
So,
we'll make sure at the end of that we get everybody's requests in,
Okay.
like we did before.
So just in terms of you talking about demographics, I have not done the demographics for the active employees, but I did do it for retirees, fairly detailed. Representative Gannon, I handed that out at the risk meetings, the risk assessment meetings back in 19. It's not updated data, but it's pretty darn good. And it breaks it out between gender, it breaks it out years of service, the AFC, by group plans. We have one for the teachers and one for the state. We'd be happy to send that over to you. I think it would be very instructive. And I have to do this. Give me one more minute. It's not germane to this subject, but if you go completely, if you go to the report that the treasurer's report, and you look at appendices F1 and F2, and I'm just going to pull this out because this is a subject near and dear to my heart. It's about gender equity and pay. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up. So this is the state system, and you see that way back in 1980, and yes, we do have retirees that are still collecting benefit from there. You see the disparity between women and men in terms of retirement benefit. The average is in the middle. There's a trend line there, but hold it this way so you can see it as well. It's gotten better. There's still a disparity, but it's gotten better. But this is something that I think we need to talk about too, outside of this, but I got to put a plug into this about, disparity in pay. Some of it's related to the time that you're in the system, your service time. The teacher system has less disparity, but it hasn't changed much since the early. So I just thought I'd point that out. And again, you see the counts at the bottom of how many people we have that are still collecting benefits from those ages. And that says something about the health of Vermont in terms of folks. And the good news is that the living obviously has a cost impact, but I'm delighted to see those folks still collecting benefits. The last piece, and I think it impacts women as well as older retirees. I was at a teacher, every year I've gone to not this past year because of COVID, a retiree meeting, Retired Teachers Association meeting in Rutland. And this person who spoke ahead of me gave a presentation on how to apply for food stamps. Okay. To me, after a full year of public service, whether you're in the state system or the teacher system, you should not be having to apply for food stamps. It's just a travesty, in my opinion. My concern is the next generation, the generation after that, why we have to have retirement security. And say, well, Beth, you're also talking about, benefit changes and the legislatures. We have to find that balance, but we have to continue to maintain retirement security. And as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, it's a massive increase in the bankruptcies for older folks. this is something we should continue to take a look at. I want security for the next generation, as do you, but we need to take a look at that balance as we're looking at this. That was mind-boggling to me, and that was maybe 4 years ago, but that I heard that presentation, I was appalled. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to say before we break for lunch, but thank you.
I'll stay if you want me to, but I don't think you do.
You
Okay.
said that you could control your own behavior and you could predict that, but you couldn't predict the behavior of teachers or state employees. And I will tell you that my guess is that most teachers and state employees are probably voters.
Mhm.
And according to the Constitution, voters are required to be of a quiet and peaceable behavior.
Okay. Well, as I said,
So that we
yep.
can assume that they will all be of a quiet and peaceable behavior.
Okay. As I said earlier, 75% of the retirees in the teacher system live in Vermont, 78% in the state system. And my presumption is the active workforce probably follows pretty closely to that. So take it from there. Thank you. Great questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to go over this. You can tell I hate the situation we're in. And in all seriousness, it's mind-boggling. We have to deal with it. It's painful. But you can also tell I kind of get into the subject fairly deeply. I'm happy to come back, answer questions. I do validate everything through the actuaries. And we are a resource for the boards. The 3 board of trustees are the fiduciaries in it. And we work with them, as you know, Eric, and they set the guidelines on where we're headed with these things. So we'll keep them informed as well.
Thank you.
I won't say pleasure because of what I just said, but thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Well, folks, that was a lot to digest in a morning. So please do get some fresh air during lunchtime and some sustenance. Oh, my goodness. And we will be back here for a deeper dive on demographics this afternoon, but immediately after lunch. Oh, well, we don't have a, okay, later on this afternoon, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about our reactions to this morning as well as to the demographics and start to log more questions that we might want to have answered. Yeah, I think starting around 2:30, right after we have a break.